Chapter 833. Wu He's first fear was Xiao Xian. His second fear wasn't Chief Su Li, but Gong Xie. Wu He's teeth chattered as he looked at Gong Xie blocking the door. When he was released by the Yanjiao on the other side of the continent, he didn't dare to do anything in Yanjiao territory for a long time, but he still observed them. Because of that, Wu He wanted to know more about the Yanjiao tribe. The more he observed, the more he realized that there were many special things in the Yanjiao tribe. For example, the wolf with 3 eyes. He heard that it used to be an ordinary beast that wasn't even considered a fearsome beast. Another example was the giant mountain eagle. It was said to have been raised since it was young. Other than the Hui tribe, it was the only giant mountain eagle raised by the tribesmen. Wu He knew very well how difficult it was to deal with the giant mountain eagles. There was also the bird-like creature and many other strange things. However, none of these were enough to make Wu He so wary. Wu He had the urge to run when he saw Gong Xie standing 5 steps away from him. However, he felt that some things should be cleared up. After all, he didn't participate in this incident. Just as Wu He was about to defend himself, Gong Xie slowly raised his hand. There was a ground eye stone in his hand. It was one that the Chonglis had missed when they were trying to steal it. They were in a hurry to leave, so they didn't go back and pick it up. Sizzle! The ground eye stone crumbled into dust in Gong Xie's hand. The atmosphere in the room stagnated, especially for the person who was also playing with the ground eye stone. Although the stone wasn't too hard, it wasn't so easy to crush it. Furthermore, without the use of any tools, he could easily do this with his fingers. Gong Xie's fingers didn't change at all. There wasn't even a mark. Su Li's expression darkened. He stared at Gong Xie cautiously. He felt a sense of danger. When he met Gong Xie's red eyes, his hair stood on end. On the other side, on the street where the gambling house was located, the brawl spread to half the street in a short time. By the time Ji Shou and his men arrived, the houses and shops on both sides of the street were no longer intact. Broken tiles were strewn all over the place. Especially when he heard those short and fat-bearded men spreading the news that the royal city people were cheating and stealing. He was so angry that his blood vessels were about to explode. They all needed to be taught a lesson. All of you stop. A roar filled with intense anger spread throughout the entire street. At the same time, many people in golden armor appeared, almost surrounding the entire street, especially in the center of the battlefield. Guards with bows appeared on some roofs along the street. Their cold eyes and sharp arrows were aimed at the battlefield. Under the shroud of the purple qi, the reflection of the armor was somewhat strange, causing those who wanted to take advantage of the chaos to shudder. The sound of the wooden whistle rang out with a specific rhythm, and the scattered Yanjiao soldiers quickly gathered in the direction of the sound. Ji Shou narrowed his eyes at the sight. These Yanjiao soldiers were obviously well trained, but they were different from the royal city soldiers. Their teamwork was honed through hunting. It was no wonder these people didn't have an advantage against the Yanjiao soldiers. Most of the people lying on the ground were from the royal city, but there were very few Yanjiao soldiers on the ground. The few that were on the ground were taken away when the Yanjiao soldiers closed the battlefield. There should still be people nearby taking care of the injured. When Ji Shou and the guards appeared, Wei blew the whistle for them to stop and gather. He had no doubt that if he ignored them, the Wang Chengjun would shoot. They didn't want to clash head-on with the guards in King City's territory. There was no benefit to it. The other Flaming River tribes followed the Yanjiao's lead. When they saw the Yanjiao soldiers stop, they did the same. The Ya tribesmen stopped making a ruckus and quickly hid behind the Yanjiao soldiers, hiding their short, fat bodies. They preferred dark places where there was no light at all. It was dangerous to be exposed to Yangguang. It wasn't just the Yanjiao people. When the other royal city people saw Ji Shou, they immediately stopped and wanted to run. But the guards had already surrounded them. If they ran, the guards would mercilessly turn them into porcupines. Seeing the chaos on the street stop, Ji Shou's unhappiness subsided. At least he still had his authority. These people were still afraid of him and the guards. But in the next moment, Ji Shou heard a loud bang. The ground shook. The sound didn't come from this street, but from a distance. But it happened after he shouted for them to stop. It was like a provocation. The people on the street saw Ji Shou's face darken. The veins on his forehead bulged and he looked like he wanted to eat someone. This made the royal city people, especially the gamblers, even more uneasy. They didn't dare to look directly at Ji Shou, only watching his movements from the corners of their eyes. Ji Shou tilted his head slightly. Without a word, the small group behind him quickly left, heading towards the source of the commotion. The happiest people were the people at the gambling house. They had suffered a great loss this time, losing both their people and their money. General! A junior manager of the gambling house ran over to Ji Shou as if he had seen his savior. General? Some of the Flaming River tribesmen didn't know what a general was, but he seemed powerful. General, help! Before the manager of the gambling den could finish, he felt a gust of wind. The next moment, he felt a piercing pain in his abdomen. He spat out a mouthful of blood as the strong force sent him flying backward. The people on the street all shuddered, as if the kick just now had landed on their bodies, and they felt as if they had experienced it themselves. The muscles on Bo Yi's face twitched. His anger was quickly suppressed when Ji Zhou looked over. He stopped himself from taking a step forward. Ji Shou didn't even look at the person who was kicked out, as if he was just a piece of trash. His eyes were cold and his murderous aura exploded from his body. The people on the street, especially those from Yanjiao, tensed up and looked at Ji Shou cautiously. Wei Mai and the others' eyelids twitched. This person was much stronger than the people at the gambling house. He also seemed to have a murderous aura, like a hunter. However, Yanjiao's hunters were trained to hunt fearsome beasts. This person's targets were probably humans. There were many strong people in the royal city, such as this person. Ji Shou's kick was covered in murderous aura. The person from the gambling house didn't scream, but it sounded like an inaudible wail echoed in everyone's ears. Ji Shou didn't draw his sword, but he didn't seem any less dangerous. He looked around coldly and slowly walked forward. He didn't move quickly and didn't look imposing, but those in the royal city who knew Ji Shou didn't underestimate him. Even the black bears were nervous. Ji Shou walked casually on the messy street, the wood under his feet cracking under his feet. With every step he took, the people from the royal city took a step back in unison, their eyes filled with fear. Wei and the others didn't retreat. When they saw Ji Shou reach for them, they said, "You want to attack us too? You people from the royal city stole first. You can't afford to lose and you steal." Before Wei could finish, Ji Shou was already laughing, his face full of disdain. "You should be thankful that Flaming Horn has Xiao Xian. Otherwise, no matter what, anyone who caused trouble in King City would be killed. If it weren't for the special situation today, he would have washed the street with blood." Ji Shou was mocking Yan Jiao. Without Xiao Xian, Yan Jiao and the Flaming River Valley would be nothing. They wouldn't be able to walk the streets of the royal city peacefully and cause such a ruckus. If people from other tribes or organizations in the royal city heard this, they would have been angry. It was an insult. However, Ji Shou was facing a group of Yanjiao tribesmen. When they heard Ji Shou's words, the Flaming Horn tribesmen had an expression of, "Ah, we're very lucky too." Ji Shou. It was like being fed a mouthful of moldy grain. Ji Shou felt like he couldn't communicate with these tribesmen. But the Yanjiao tribesmen really thought the same. They didn't think there was anything to be angry about. Shouldn't they be proud that their tribe had such a powerful person? Ji Shou took a deep breath. He didn't want to waste time with these tribesmen. He swept his gaze across the people on the street and said coldly, "Put down what you shouldn't have or I'll kill you." Thud. Slap. They'd planned to leave after getting some money, but now they threw it away like it was a hot rock. Compared to the benefits before them, their lives were more important. Some of them still held on to the hope that Ji Shou would not be able to find them. However, they were bumped into by their companions, whose eyes warned them not to throw their lives away for such trivial things. Ji Shou usually didn't care about small fights in the city, but once he did, it would be cruel. It was not an exaggeration to call it a bloodbath. He might even take his anger out on them. They didn't want to be implicated. Ji Shou stood there indifferently, as if he didn't know the people in the crowd were struggling. A group of guards quickly walked down the street, picking up the things thrown away and gathering them together. "Look what's missing," said Ji Shou. The tribesmen who'd placed their bets looked at Wei and Mai. With their agreement, they started searching for their own things. They didn't take anything randomly. They didn't care about the other gamblers in the royal city. There was no need to steal. They just needed to get their own. "Where's my crystal?" Abuli shouted, dissatisfied. After hearing that Xiao Xian was called crystal, Abuli changed his tone. Many people had seen Abuli's crystal before. It couldn't be faked. Everyone turned to look at the people in the gambling house. "We didn't take it." Bo Yi panted heavily. He had to be the scapegoat. "Here." An emotionless voice sounded. At the same time, the crystal as thick as an arm was thrown at Abuli. Abuli caught the crystal and looked at Gon Xie happily. Gon Xie, you found it for me? Thank you. Gon Xie's clothes were torn in many places. The most obvious were the knives and arrows that pierced through his body. Seeing Gon Xie like this, the Yanjiao people weren't too surprised. When they fought on the streets, they had to protect their own lives. But Gon Xie was different. He fought with his life on the line. They had seen this many times. Ah! Gon Xie, you've been stabbed! Abuli shouted. Quick, quick, quick! The people from King City thought that this big-footed tycoon was going to call for a witch doctor. Abuli threw the crystal in his hand to the person beside him, then grabbed the handle of the dagger that was exposed on Gon Xie's body and pulled it out. He pulled it out. The streets fell silent again. Hey, there's another arrow. He pulled it out again. There was no blood, no flesh and blood. There wasn't even a cry of pain. No, it was more accurate to say that Gon Xie, who had been hit countless times, didn't make a sound. His expression didn't even change. It was as if he couldn't feel the injuries on his body. Hey, you have a lot of things on you. But they're too small. It's hard to pull them out. Abuli felt that since Gon Xie helped him find the crystal, he should help. However, Gon Xie was getting impatient. He pushed Abuli away and the hidden weapons that had been stabbed into his body came out. They fell to the ground with a clatter. Ji Shou, the guards. Luckily, they had undergone strict training. Otherwise, if their hands trembled, the arrows on their bows would have been shot. If they shot by mistake, they would be killed by Ji Shou. The royal city people gulped. They looked at Gon Xie as if he was a monster. Thus, Gon Xie gained another nickname in the royal city people's hearts, Undying Gon Xie. Ji Shou's face twitched as he watched Gon Xie expel the hidden weapons from his body without a single drop of blood. One of the guards hurried over and whispered something into Ji Shou's ear. They were the people who had been sent to check on the explosion. Hearing the report, Ji Shou's pupils constricted. His expression changed. The explosion came from one of the Chong Li's strongholds. It had been destroyed. Su Li was heavily injured and was rescued by other Chong Lis who had just arrived at Royal City. The number of casualties was unknown. The entire stronghold had been flattened and turned into sand. It was impossible to tell what it used to be. No other clues could be found. The person who had caused this was the person who had just arrived. Ji Shou only had one word to say about the Chong Lis. They deserved it. However, there was indeed a dangerous person in Yanjiao's group. Gon Xie? Other than Yanjiao's Xiao Xian, Ji Shou made a mental note of the second dangerous person. Whoosh! Shouts came from other parts of the royal city. However, it wasn't because someone was causing trouble. The purple aura above the royal city was beginning to change. It was retracting like fog. In the palace, the signing ceremony for the Heaven and Earth contract was about to end. Chapter 834. When Xiao Xian walked out of the garden after signing the contract, the others were silent, especially the heads of the noble families. They looked at Xiao Xian strangely with complicated emotions. However, Ji Feng was the same as before. He chatted with Xiao Xian about old stories in Royal City. At least on the surface, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Xiao Xian only heard about the large-scale brawl on Royal City's busiest street after he came out. However, they weren't the ones who attacked first. Logically speaking, the gambling house and Chang'e were the ones at fault. Therefore, Ji Feng didn't hesitate to discuss with Xiao Xian how to deal with this. It didn't seem unreasonable. However, Gigu and the others knew that if Yanjiao wasn't strong enough and didn't have a special person like Xiao Xian, the royal city wouldn't be so polite to them. The strange phenomenon when the Heaven and Earth contract was signed was enough to make the people of Royal City wary. Even if they didn't know what Xiao Xian left behind, they could guess based on Ji Feng and the five heads' reactions. Xiao Xian was the key to their change of attitude. Yanjiao's Grand Elder was indeed different from the rest. They rejoiced that Xiao Xian was Yanjiao. If Xiao Xian wasn't from Yanjiao and was born in another tribe, Yanjiao would probably be in a different situation now. The farce on the street ended with the Yanjiao people taking their belongings back to where they were settled and the gambling house paying for all the losses. Many people in Royal City were surprised that the Ji family let the tribesmen off so easily. Many times, things couldn't be avoided just because you were in the right. However, this time, the Ji family and the other 5 noble families of Royal City all had the same attitude. This made people think deeply, especially those who were good at conspiracy theories. Their brains spun quickly and thought of many possibilities. Among them, the most active were the caravans. The contract between Royal City and Yanjiao was an equal peace contract. When the time came, travel teams from both sides would be able to cross over. Thinking that the tribe was rich in gems, but there were very few gold mines, the caravan members trembled with excitement as soon as they thought about how great the business opportunity was. This time, without waiting for the Black Bears to say anything, many other trading parties who happened to be in King City rushed to visit the Flaming Horn tribe settlement. Inside the palace, Xiao Xian had a private chat with Ji Feng after the signing of the contract. Ji Feng brought up Si. Si would like to meet you in the palace. Ji Feng observed Xiao Xian's reaction as he spoke. He thought Xiao Xian would be enraged at the mention of Si, but that was not the case. Sure. Xiao Xian's tone didn't change. His expression was calm as if he wasn't surprised that Ji Feng would mention Si. This confused Ji Feng, but as long as he achieved his goal, it was fine. He arranged a place for Xiao Xian and Si to meet alone. After all, Si was the leader of the largest slave trading organization. It wasn't convenient for him to appear in the palace. In fact, very few people knew about Ji Feng and Si's partnership. Before Ji Feng seized the throne, other than a few trusted aides, even Ji Shou didn't know about their partnership. Si Duo's visits to the palace only started after Ji Feng succeeded in seizing the throne. It was also because of the Flaming Horn incident that more people knew about their collaboration. This time, Si came with a humble attitude and apologized for his attack on the Flaming Horn tribe. Xiao Xian ignored that. It would be strange if Si was apologetic, more like remorseful. However, it wasn't easy for Si to put on a low profile. Just tell me why you're here, Xiao Xian said. Si's prepared speech was wasted. Still, it was better to get straight to the point. Si's goal was simple. He wanted Xiao Xian to help him find the chief's bone lock. He used some benefits from one of the robbers, in exchange for some information about Robber 7. None of the information was related to Robber 7's whereabouts. This was because robbers rarely revealed their whereabouts to others. Even when they worked together, they would keep some information to themselves. This was a robber's habit. Si didn't place all his hopes on this information. However, while Robber 7's whereabouts were unknown, he knew some of Robber 7's dark history. For example, Robber 7 had been captured by Yanjiao more than once. More specifically, Robber 7 had suffered at the hands of Yanjiao's Xiao Xian more than once. This was why Si came to Xiao Xian after Ji Feng mediated. Robber 7's ability to escape was too great. Even the top 3 in the robber family might not be able to catch Robber 7. Although Robber 7's ranking wasn't high, he was getting harder to deal with. Even if they found him, they wouldn't be able to catch him. Bai isn't the only slave trading organization. Just because we don't attack Flaming River doesn't mean others won't. However, if you can help me find the chief's bone lock, I'm willing to sacrifice some benefits for them to avoid Flaming River Alliance's territory, said Si. Yanjiao can do that too, replied Xiao Xian. But it'll still cause a lot of trouble. I think Yanjiao doesn't want people to go missing in the next few years or even decades, continued Si. With Si's help, it would save a lot of manpower and time. What Yanjiao lacked right now was manpower and time. Everyone knew that the contract with Royal City was only a temporary truce. Once the contract expired, there would be an unavoidable conflict. The Yi family's divination was unpredictable. Who could accurately predict the future? Any small change could lead to a completely different outcome. The safest way was to develop oneself. Only when one was strong enough would they have enough capital to negotiate and solve all problems. If they diverted manpower and time to deal with those problems, the development of the Flaming River region would definitely slow down. With Si's promise, even if it couldn't solve all the problems, it would be worth it to solve a part of it. However, Xiao Xian didn't answer immediately. After a moment of silence he said, "Deal." With Xiao Xian agreeing to help, Si sighed in relief. At least there was still a high chance of getting the chief's bone lock back. On his way out, Si suddenly paused at the door and turned to ask, "I heard that you know the Yi family's divination skills. Did you predict that I would come looking for you again because of the chief's bone malak? What do you think?" "I think so. Motherfucker Yanjiao." Si cursed internally. He didn't look at Xiao Xian anymore and walked out. What a shame. His buy was cut off, his bone lock was stolen, he was chased everywhere and now he had to beg for help. He accepted his defeat at the hands of Xiao Xian, but from now on, he would have to be more careful when it came to Yanjiao. The banquet at the palace was sumptuous, but Ji Feng didn't talk about sparring. Xiao Xian wasn't interested in sparring either. He was distracted. Xiao Xian's absent-mindedness was noticed by everyone, but no one reminded him. Because of the strange phenomenon during the signing of the contract, everyone in the royal city couldn't wait for Yanjiao to leave. They were very curious about these things, but they also knew that they wouldn't be able to get anything out of him. At the beginning of the banquet, some people tried to ask him about it, but Xiao Xian didn't answer. The other flaming horns didn't say much either. Gigu and the others didn't know much about the founder shaman seal, but they wouldn't reveal even the tiniest bit. Xiao Xian also saw Ji Ju at the banquet. Compared to the last time he saw Ji Ju looked even older now. Under normal circumstances, this shouldn't be the case. The Ji family had a long lifespan, and Ji Ju had the medicinal crops from the farm and the 1,000-grain gold. He shouldn't have aged so much. But considering what had happened in the past few years, it was understandable that Ji Ju had become like this. The past few years hadn't been peaceful. Large amounts of crops had died in the disaster. Yi Xiong's revenge, the change in the throne, the Yi family's upheaval and so on had been very torturous. Especially the first one, the farm that Ji Ju had always cared about. It had suffered heavy losses in the disaster. Many of the crops that had been carefully cared for and had high hopes for had all died. The reorganization after the cataclysm was also very exhausting. Many things had to be personally supervised by Ji Ju, which was very tiring. If there was anyone in the Ji family that Yanjiao liked, it would be Ji Ju. Other than the 1,000-grain gold, most of the popular crops in Yanjiao had been given to them by Ji Ju. Ji Ju sighed when he saw Xiao Xian again. Years ago, when the late king had decided to kill Yanjiao, Ji Ju had gone to the palace to vent his anger. Unfortunately, he hadn't been involved in politics and couldn't interfere. The decision of the royal city's 6 noble families couldn't be changed by him alone. But the one who overthrew the throne wasn't an outsider but a member of the Ji family. It was good that Ji Feng had taken over the throne. At least Ji Ju approved of Ji Feng's decision to sign a peace treaty with Yanjiao. No matter what others said about Yanjiao, Ji Ju had his own judgment. Ji Ju thought that a tribe that could grow good grains was definitely worth making friends with. Ji Ju was very happy to see Xiao Xian again. After the banquet, he even invited Xiao Xian to the farm for a chat. Xiao Xian didn't refuse. He felt that Ji Ju must have other matters to discuss with him at this late hour. He let Gigu and the rest go back to check on the others. Xiao Xian followed Ji Ju out of the city to the farm. Gigu and the rest went directly to Yanjiao's place. Although they'd received reports that everything was fine, as the leader, Gigu was still worried. After all, this was royal city territory. He had to see for himself. Also, Xiao Xian had whispered to him about his decision before leaving. Gigu was also concerned. Things didn't look good. Xiao Xian followed Ji Ju to the farm. Ji Ju couldn't wait to ask if the seeds he'd given him had been planted and how they were growing. When he heard that the seeds were growing well and that the field had expanded, the 1,000-grain gold situation was under control, Ji Ju smiled from the bottom of his heart. He stuffed more seeds into Xiao Xian's hands and told him what kind of crops they were and what to pay attention to when planting them. He told Xiao Xian everything. After Xiao Xian noted it down, Ji Ju paused and said, "Actually, there's another reason I called you here tonight. An old friend wants to see you but he can't move around." Chapter 835. Ji Ju told Xiao Xian about this person's background. It was up to Xiao Xian to decide whether to meet him or not. Ji Ju's old friend was a member of the Yi family. His name was Yi Jie and he was Yi Zong's grandfather. After the Yi family's incident, Yi Jie was seriously injured in the internal conflict and was brought over by Ji Ju to recuperate. Otherwise, Yi Jie would have died if he had stayed in the Yi family. After bringing Xiao Xian to a corner, Ji Ju opened the door and saw an old man with white hair lying on a bed. He did not look well and his body was weak. His breathing was weak. Seeing Xiao Xian come over, Yi Jie sat up with difficulty. Just the act of sitting up took a lot of energy. Xiao Xian looked at Yi Jie's expression. He did not see any hatred in his eyes, only curiosity. As if he saw Xiao Xian's confusion, Yi Jie forced a smile. His body was injured from the internal conflict and his smile was ugly. Moreover, facing Xiao Xian, Yi Jie's emotions were already complicated and his expression was even more strange. Yi Zong had died in Yanjiao. Xiao Xian had played a part in Yi Qi's death. However, the main reason was that Yi Xiong and the Yi family were not as powerful. If not for Xiao Xian, more members of the Yi family would have died at Yi Xiong's hands. I just want to ask about Yi Zong. Yi Jie spoke slowly and with difficulty. His voice was not loud but his words were clear enough for Xiao Xian to hear. Xiao Xian had come over because of Ji Ju. Yi Jie had helped Ji Ju many times, especially when it came to finding crops. Yi Jie had helped Ji Ju a lot and had a good relationship with Ji Ju. However, Xiao Xian did not expect Yi Jie to mention Yi Zong so calmly. Although surprised, Xiao Xian still told him about Yi Zong's situation at that time, starting from when Yi Zong agreed to go to Yanjiao as a captive, and then the deal with Yi Zong. Yi Zong could be considered to have committed suicide. He could have survived, but he chose such a method. Yi Jie listened to Xiao Xian's story with his eyes closed, hiding all his emotions. When Xiao Xian finished, he opened his eyes again. His eyes had calmed down. Slowly taking a few deep breaths, Yi Jie said, "Did you do any divination when you came to the royal city?" Xiao Xian looked at him in surprise but did not deny it. "Yes. How is it?" After a pause, Xian realized that his question was a little vague, so he added, "It's about the result of the return journey. I didn't find anything. Did the divination fail? Or did it succeed, but there was no result?" Yi Jie asked again. "The latter. Even if the knot was successfully knotted, the knot did not have any meaning. It was like gibberish." Now that the power of divination had increased greatly, Xiao Xian could even divine Robber Seven's location, but he could not divine anything about the return journey. Xiao Xian had been wondering about this for a long time. He also felt that something was amiss, but he could not find the answer. Before they came, the knot did not reveal any danger beyond their ability. But now, the return journey was getting closer and closer, and the results were still the same. This was different from Xiao Xian's intuition. Xiao Xian's intuition told him that there was danger, and between intuition and knots, he trusted his intuition more. His intuition helped him avoid all the life-threatening dangers he had experienced since he was young. Divination was a skill he learned from other tribes, and the Yi family was better at it than he was. This was also why Xiao Xian did not want to stay in the royal city for long. His original plan was to let the people of the Flaming River Valley take a good look at the royal city. It would be beneficial for the development of the Flaming River Valley in the future. Since he was ambitious, his vision could not be limited to this small place. Only by recognizing himself could he go further. Overestimating himself would only lead to faster destruction. However, after coming here, the increasing uneasiness made Xiao Xian change his mind. During the banquet, he told Gigu and the others to return straight away instead of taking them to see the famous golden grain fields. He wanted them to go back and prepare. They might have to leave early. The unknown is the most dangerous. Be careful on this trip. Yi Jie stared into Xiao Xian's eyes, emphasizing every word. Only the Yi family can change the results of the divination. But now, there was no one in the royal city who could do such a thing from the Yi family. Yi Xiong of the desert. Xiao Xian immediately recognized this name. Actually, when he had a hunch that the return trip would not be smooth, he had already thought of many possibilities, including how to deal with Yi Xiong. Now, Yi Jie's words confirmed that the danger this time came from Yi Xiong. What could be done had been done. Yi Jie could not help much. He did not find anything useful either, but as a member of the main branch of the Yi family, he knew more. He knew that someone might be deliberately interfering with the divination. That child is called Yi Su? Good, very good. Yi Jie had tears in his eyes, but he did not say anything else. Knowing that Yi Su was living well in Yanjiao was enough. It was not that he was satisfied, but because he was a member of the Yi family. Even if he could not perform a divination now, he could deduce more based on Xiao Xian's words. Without asking, he could deduce Yi Su's current situation. Thus, the purpose of this meeting would be accomplished. Xiao Xian knew that Yi Jie had said everything he wanted to say to him, mainly because of Yi Su. Xiao Xian did not stay long. He planned to return to Yanjiao that very night to check on the situation. Ji Ju did not force him. He sent someone to escort him into the city. The city gates were already closed. Without Ji Ju's escort, Xiao Xian might not be able to enter easily. After Xiao Xian left, Ji Ju thought for a moment, then asked Yi Jie, You really don't mind Yizong's death? Ji knew how much Yi Jie cared about Yizong. In fact, the Yi family did not care as much about blood ties as other tribes. Among the many grandchildren, Yizong was valued by Yi Jie because of Yizong's talent. Yizong was raised by Yi Jie, and he had high hopes for him. Yi Jie had even thought of letting Yizong fight for the position of head of the family in the future. However, Yizong's death made people sigh. It also made some of the younger members of the Yi family secretly happy. They had one less competitor. The person who had always been above them had finally kicked the bucket. Very few people knew that Yizong had taken his son out of the family and placed him in Yanjiao. Yi Jie only found out about Yizong's arrangement later. At first, he did not understand why Yizong would do that. After calming down and thinking about it, he figured it out, and it became clearer and clearer. It would be a lie to say that I don't mind. However, in comparison, I agree with Yizong's decision. If it were me, I would have done the same, said Yi Jie. He had only seen his great-grandson briefly since birth. In terms of feelings, he naturally could not compare to Yizong, who he had raised himself. However, as Yi Jie thought about it, one emotion replaced all other feelings of hatred, anger, and regret. Why? Ji did not understand. Yizong could have survived. If he had been there, Yisu would have had someone to protect him in Yanjiao. As long as he was alive, he would have had a chance to return to Royal City. For example, this time, during the contract trip between Royal City and Yanjiao, if Yizong had been there, he could have made a deal with Yanjiao. With Yizong's ability, it would not have been difficult for him to do this. You don't understand, said Yi Jie softly. Yi Jie whispered, I heard that when the flaming horns raise beasts, they look for beasts that are separated from their tribe. They don't have a mother. The earlier they leave the tribe, the better. That way, the tribe will trust them and get closer to them. This analogy, Ji thought to himself. Who would compare their great-grandson to an animal? Yi Jie did not think much of it. As long as he could use the simplest way to make Ji understand the reason, it was fine. After drinking a bowl of medicine, Yi Jie said, You know how talented Yizong is. When the late king sent troops to kill Yanjiao, Yizong followed. When he came back, he encountered a bottleneck. Back then, I did not understand why Yizong would encounter such a situation. But now I know the reason. He sighed. It was unclear whether he felt pity for Yizong or regret. After a moment of silence, Yi Jie continued. The ancestor of the Yi family is the closest person to the witch ancestor. Xiao is not the witch ancestor, but he is definitely related to the witch ancestor. Yisu stayed close to Xiao, so he must have his own opportunity. And this opportunity will change the future of the Yi family. That is, the hope of the Yi family's rise. Yisu. I really want to see him. I have to endure until the day Yisu returns to the Yi family. Yi Jie's eyes flashed with madness. If something happened to Xiao, then all his hopes would be shattered. Yisu would not be the Yisu he had hoped for. All his predictions were based on Xiao's safe return to Flaming River. That was why Yi Jie had used up all his divination when he was heavily injured. That was why today's meeting had taken place. Yi Jie's condition was not good. He had even used up all his divination when he was heavily injured. Ji thought Yi Jie was seeking death and might not last long. But looking at Yi Jie's condition now, Yi Jie's will to live was still very strong. Ji shook his head at Yi Jie's agitated growl. No one was crazier than the Yi family. In the palace, Ji Shou told Ji Feng about what happened on the streets today in detail. He emphasized Gan Xie. Other than Xiao, he was the second person he felt threatened by. The Yanjiao people and the Flaming River people work well together. Ji Shou had to admit this. He was envious because the 6 divisions of the royal city had worked well together when the city was first built. But as time passed, their differences grew and conflicts continued. The Yi family's fate was a good example. Yes, they work well together. As long as Xiao is here, they will continue to expand, said Ji Feng. Why does Xiao have to exist? Ji Shou was depressed. Indeed, why does Yanjiao have to have Xiao? Ji Feng agreed, then smiled. Whether Yanjiao has such a person in the future depends on whether they can return safely this time. They had signed a contract, but if they did not attack Yanjiao, would there not be anyone else? For example, a certain person in the desert. After signing a contract with Yanjiao, Ji Feng planned to work with Yanjiao to guard against the desert. It would be best if both sides suffered. Chapter 836. Yan Jiao stayed in the royal city for 3 days. Even though Xiao Xian wanted to leave as soon as possible, the team still needed time to rest. If they didn't travel in good condition, they might be delayed and suffer more losses. However, they didn't slack off during these 3 days. They went shopping and received guests. More and more caravans came over to curry favor. For now, Yan Jiao only signed an agreement with the Black Bear caravan. This agreement involved the Flaming River tribe, the Longboat tribe, and the Black Bear caravan. It was beneficial to all 3 parties. As for the other caravans, Yan Jiao didn't know much about them. They would have to wait and see how these caravans perform. Yan Jiao's trip to the royal city also meant that the sea route was officially opened. In the future, more and more caravans would use the sea route to travel to the other side. Other than the chaos on the streets that day, many people in the royal city welcomed the tribesmen from the Flaming River tribe. This was because the tribesmen had a lot of good goods. Everyone was satisfied with the trade. The tribesmen got what they wanted, and the merchants in the royal city also got their gems at satisfactory prices. The people in the royal city were very prideful, so they didn't lack ornaments. Rare gems were undoubtedly a symbol of status. This time, there were more gems flowing into the royal city than before. Soon, people on the streets could see the gems around their necks and fingers. It was as if they had become rich overnight. The tribesmen were also very satisfied with the rewards they received from this trip. Not only were they rewarded with material goods, but they also received many important experiences. The gemstones they paid were only a small portion of what they had. Take the crystal in Abuli's hand for example. In the drumming tribe, a crystal like that wasn't much, but it was able to cause a stir here, just like how metal weapons shocked the tribe back then. No one could say for sure whether this exchange would speed up destruction or development. Who was smart and who was stupid? Who would gain the most benefits? No one could say for sure. Time would prove everything. 3 days later, the Flaming River tribe's team left the royal city. Looking at the 3 flags in the distance, the merchants in the royal city were reluctant to part with them. If there were no more gems to earn, of course, he would be reluctant. Their impression of the other continent was limited to the Flaming River Basin and Yanjiao, as well as the longboat that could travel by sea. As for the other tribes, they didn't have much of a presence here. The caravans were already getting restless. The Black Bears were also preparing for their first trip across the sea. What was surprising was that the 6 aristocrats of the royal city were unusually quiet. They did not move for a long time, as if they were waiting for something. While the Yanjiao team was making their way back, somewhere far away from the coast and the royal city, in a forest on a mountain, Robber 7 was sleeping on a thick tree branch. After stealing the chief's bone lock from Yanjiao, Robber 7 had avoided Yanjiao's team and hid here. Before this, he had spread the news to the rest of the robbers, letting them know that he, Robber 7, had stolen C's chief's bone lock again. Robber 7 was waiting for Yanjiao to leave before he came out to stir up trouble. By then, he wouldn't have to worry about anything. Other than Xiao Xian, Robber 7 wasn't afraid of anyone. Although Gong Xie gave him a dangerous feeling, Robber 7 believed that if he could avoid him once, he could do it again. Gong Xie was nothing, Robber 7 thought. With that in mind, Robber 7 lived a peaceful life. Every day, he would hide in the forest and sleep, counting the time in boredom. An eagle's cry jolted Robber 7 out of his reverie. He knew all the birds that frequented the mountains, but the eagle's cry didn't belong to any of the species that would normally appear in the mountains. Moreover, this eagle's cry was familiar to Robber 7. He thought of the eagle from the Flaming Horn tribe, but he didn't think it was possible. He had already hidden so far away. How could he still hear it? Cautiously, Robber 7 flipped open the branches above him and observed the situation in the sky through the small gaps between the leaves. An eagle was circling in the sky. The other birds on the mountain avoided it and the wild beasts hid as well, afraid of being targeted. Against a high-level predator, they could only hide to save their lives. The surroundings quieted down, with only the occasional echo of the eagle's cry. The eagle in the sky flew lower. It was much larger than an ordinary eagle, and with the pattern of its feathers and the cry, Robber 7 no longer held on to any hope. It's really that eagle. Why is it here? If this eagle is here, then where is Xiao Xian? Is Xiao Xian here too? Robber 7 panicked. He could feel his bones aching all over. He didn't dare to imagine what would happen if he was caught again. The last time he escaped, it was because C appeared with his men and held Xiao Xian back. This time, no one else came to distract him. Was he in for it? Soon enough, Robber 7 realized that there was no one else on the eagle's back. But that didn't mean that no one else would appear. Robber 7 didn't dare to move. He quickly treated himself as a tree rooted in the forest, blending in with the surroundings. He didn't even notice the bug bite. His eyes were fixed on the sky, and at the same time, he paid attention to any movements around him. The eagle in the sky circled around the mountain. After a few more rounds, Robber 7 saw that the eagle in the sky had dropped something on the ground. It fell into the forest. Robber 7 looked at the eagle in the sky again. It didn't fly down to the ground to investigate. Instead, it circled around and left. Robber 7 waited patiently for half a day, but he didn't notice any other movements. Moreover, the surroundings were starting to regain their vitality. The birds and beasts that were hiding were starting to come out. The eagle had left, and there weren't any strangers or beasts nearby. Robber 7 didn't notice anything. When the sun was about to set, Robber 7 couldn't hold back his curiosity. He carefully crept towards the place where the object fell. Finally, he found it on a tree. It was a bamboo tube with 2 words written on it, Robber 7. When he saw the 2 words, Robber 7's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him that it wasn't anything good. But he was even more curious. Why would the eagle drop this bamboo tube here? Was it a coincidence, or was it intentional? After some hesitation, Robber 7 couldn't hold back his curiosity. He went over to the tree and took down the bamboo tube. He twisted it open. Inside the bamboo tube was a scroll made of animal skin. There were words written on it. Robber 7 was like a statue. His body was stiff as he stared at the words on the scroll. The more he looked, the paler his face became. It was as if he was frightened, and as if he was discouraged. Bam! Robber 7 slammed the scroll on the ground. His face turned from pale to red as he panted heavily. The words on the scroll were written by Xiao Xian. He wanted Robber 7 to deliver the item to Yanjiao himself. It didn't say what would happen if Robber 7 didn't do it. But the more Robber 7 thought about it, the more he felt lucky. No one in the robber clan knew of Robber 7's whereabouts, and no one from Bai could find him no matter how hard they tried. However, the eagle had left a scroll here. It was just an ordinary scroll, but to Robber 7, it was like a bomb. He couldn't recover from it for a few days. Regardless of Robber 7's decision after receiving the scroll, Yanjiao's team continued with their original plan. Unlike when they came, the cities they passed by on their way back were no longer on full alert. They even opened their gates to welcome them. They hoped that Yanjiao's team could stay in their cities for a long time. Some caravans that didn't make it to the royal city tried to approach Yanjiao to talk about cooperation. The news of the peace treaty had already spread to other cities. Then, the traveling teams would spread the news to even further places. A new situation was about to unfold. Some saw danger, while others saw opportunity. Whether or not they could seize it depended on their own abilities. The reputation of the Longboat tribe's fleet had already spread far and wide. Mu Fa had already received several requests for cooperation. Thinking back to the time when he brought his team here, they were ostracized by many parties and it was difficult for them to move forward. Now, the tables had turned. As long as the longboats did not court death, they would prosper soon. After the team returned to the place where they disembarked, they waited for a few days for Cha-Cha to return. This time, the people of the Longboat tribe and the other tribes were relaxed. Their ambitions were also growing. If the gap between the two sides was too big, they wouldn't have the courage to think about surpassing the other side. But now, they realized that the other side wasn't as scary as the rumors said. But soon, they noticed that the people of Yanjiao were unusually quiet. Ever since they left the royal city, they had been on high alert. They were even more alert than before. Did something happen? Mu Fa asked, remembering that Xiao Xian had the ability to perform divination. I don't know, but it's better to be cautious, Gigu replied. Xiao Xian stood alone at the bow of the ship, looking at the boundless sea in front of him. They were already far away from the mainland. They couldn't see the mainland, but the feeling of uneasiness was getting stronger. Something was definitely about to happen. The knots were the same as before. The knots were meaningless. Xiao Xian didn't expect to use it to perform divination. He just quietly sensed his surroundings. The weather was good today. The sky was clear and blue. Only where the sea met the sky were there some shadows of white clouds. The wind wasn't strong. Before they went out to sea, the people of the longboat had said that there would be continuous good weather. There wouldn't be any storms for a while, but the weather at sea was ever-changing. They still had to be careful. Until now, Xueqi hadn't heard from the people of the longboat tribe that there was going to be a storm. There were some slight changes in the sea current, but the people of the longboat said it wasn't a big problem. Then what was the hidden danger? Xueqi stared into the distance, lost in thought. Suddenly, a huge shadow rushed over. He couldn't see its face clearly, but its huge size was enough to shock Xueqi. It was similar to the giant crocodile Xueqi had seen before. It was comparable to the largest giant eagles at Eagle Mountain. Not to mention the largest ship in the fleet. Even the combined size of the entire fleet couldn't compare to this thing. Formless pressure and killing intent, like a sudden tsunami, rushed directly at him. Xueqi took a deep breath. When he looked again, he found that the sea was still calm. There was only the sound of laughter and the sound of the waves hitting the ship. But Xueqi knew that it wasn't an illusion. It was an omen. "It's coming," Xueqi said in a low voice. "What?" Mu Fa, who came to find Xueqi, heard this and hurriedly took out a telescope to look at the sea. He didn't find anything suspicious. The weather was also within their expectations, so he didn't understand what Xueqi meant by "it's coming." "What's coming?" Gigu and the others also hurried over. They knew that Xueqi wouldn't say this for no reason. Since Xueqi said "it's coming," something must be happening, and it couldn't be good. "What's the plan?" Gigu asked. "I'll lure him away. You guys go first." Xueqi said, "His target is me. We can't fight him head-on the sea. You won't win either. I'll lure him away. You guys continue with the original plan. Keep an eye on Caesar. It can sense danger before you. It can see things that you can't see." Xueqi had always thought that Yixiong would deal with him on land. After all, Yixiong liked places without water. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lived in the desert. Yixiong's puppets were all dehydrated and preferred dry places. For example, Gon Xie. Even though he had changed a lot of his habits, he still didn't like places with water. He didn't like to leave the cabin when he was at sea. The corpse-like puppets in the desert should be the same. Xueqi had been on guard when they were heading to the royal city. He had also made preparations on the way from the royal city to the coast. But in the end, they met at sea. There were too many restrictions on the sea. With Yixiong's abilities, even if they won, they would suffer great losses. Besides, with others around, Xueqi's hands would be tied. In that case, it was better for him to lure Yixiong away and let the fleet return first. Xueqi leaped onto the eagle's back and reminded Gigu and Mu Fa, "Be careful in the sea. You don't have to be wary of people." Xueqi rode the eagle into the air. He had to choose a direction, but he couldn't just pick it randomly. Which direction should they fly? At times like this, Xueqi trusted his instincts more. "That way, fly higher," Xueqi said to Cha-Cha. Gigu and the others saw Xueqi leave on the eagle. "That direction. Is he going to settle it on land?" Mu Fa said. The further they went in that direction, the closer the two continents were to each other. The place closest to each other was the place where Rock Hill City and the nobles fought a long war. When Xueqi heard Mu Fa's words, he agreed. There were too many restrictions on the sea. On land, even in the desert, it was better than in the sea. But reality was not what they thought it was. When Xueqi made his choice, his first thought was not Mu Fa's guess. He felt that there was a chance of survival there. It was a gut feeling. Secondly, Xueqi thought of all sorts of ways to deal with Yixiong. It would be best if they could get on land earlier. To the desert or somewhere else. Chapter 837. As soon as Xueqi left, Gigu, Mu Fa, and the others were still discussing what kind of danger they might encounter when they heard Caesar growling. He looked very anxious, as if he felt that some kind of danger was approaching. Thinking of what Xueqi said before he left, they stopped discussing and hurriedly paid attention to the situation around them. Caesar's reaction meant that he had discovered something. "Caesar, what's the matter?" Gigu observed Caesar's every movement. He noticed that Caesar was growling anxiously, sometimes facing the sea, sometimes looking down. When he was facing the sea, he didn't have a fixed direction, but he was growling down. Does this mean that there's something under the ship? Or in the sea? Xian had warned them that they didn't necessarily have to be on guard against people. Then, could it be a sea beast? Fa blew the emergency alert whistle, and the atmosphere in the fleet suddenly became tense. Caesar's growling grew louder and more anxious, as if he was afraid of something. When they were hunting in the forest, Caesar didn't show any signs of fear even when he encountered some ferocious beasts that were difficult to deal with. But now, Xueqi and the others' hearts sank. They were afraid that the trouble was bigger than they thought. Fa took out his binoculars and observed the surrounding sea. He didn't see anything that could pose a threat to them, but, twitching his nose, Fa asked, "Do you guys smell something?" "It's a little stinky," Gigu said. Previously, he thought it was an illusion, or maybe it was because someone in the fleet didn't clean up after killing the fish. But now, the stench was getting stronger and stronger. It was obviously different from the food debris on the ship. The smell was pungent. "It smells like rotten fish," a warrior of the longboat tribe said, looking at the net in his hand that he had just pulled up. Just now, he and a few others worked together to cast the net to catch fish. Now they didn't catch many fish, but they found a lot of strange fragments. "What's that?" Fa frowned and went over to look at the things in the net. "I don't know." The warrior who was pulling the net took a whiff and leaned back with a twisted face. "It stinks." To people who were not used to the stench, the smell was disgusting. The people on the longboat could still bear it, but the others couldn't. "What the hell is this? Hurry up and throw it away," someone said while pinching his nose. The soldiers pulling the net were about to throw the smelly pieces into the sea, but Fa stopped them. When they were sailing, they would sometimes face a shortage of food, but even if they were hungry, they would not eat the dead fish in the sea. After eating some of the dead fish, with their physique as totem warriors, they could still bear it. But some fish, when rotting, would produce a terrible stench, and at the same time, it was highly toxic. Even powerful totem warriors could not resist it. However, their understanding of the sea was limited. They could not tell which fish were edible and which were not. But after so many voyages, they found that most of the fish were inedible. So in the fleet, Fa simply did not let anyone touch the rotting fish. Now, in front of them, these rotting pieces of meat that were pulled up by the net should have fallen from some kind of sea beast in the sea. "It should be a big guy." Fa held his breath and used a metal stick to poke at the pieces of meat. After observing, he came to a conclusion. "There are dead sea beasts in the sea, Chief." The warrior standing on the edge of the boat was shocked. "What?" Gigu strode to the edge of the boat and looked at the sea. He was also shocked. On the sea surface, there were many similar rotting pieces of meat floating up from the water. The surrounding area was shrouded in a strong stench. Not only them, but a large area on the sea surface was the same. Those rotting pieces of meat of different sizes rose and fell on the sea surface. It was a horrifying sight. "Something is wrong with the current." An old warrior of the longboat tribe frowned. There was always a reason for all changes, but they couldn't find a suitable reason to explain this phenomenon. Observing the movement of these currents, they felt more like there was a huge object moving under the water. Fortunately, the place with the most rotting meat was not here, but a little further away. Caesar's low growl became more intense. The hair all over his body stood up like steel needles. The third eye in the middle of his forehead was wide open, but his pupils were contracted. This was a reaction when facing a stronger creature. Creak! The boat began to shake. Waves suddenly appeared on the sea surface. However, the wind at this time was not strong enough to cause such waves. "There's something under the sea. Be careful." The crew of the longboat tribe were busy controlling the boat. They were afraid that if they were not careful, they would be overturned by the waves. There were bigger waves in the distance. They rose and were broken by another current. The seawater was stirred up, and the stench became more pungent. But at this time, no one cared about it. They all stared nervously at the sea surface. Wha! The waves rose, and a huge broken tail broke the surface of the sea. It made a circle in the air, and then smashed into the sea again. The waves caused the fleet to shake violently. If it were not for the experienced crew of the longboat tribe controlling the boat, there would have been a boat overturned by the waves. They were so far away, and if they were closer, what kind of impact would they suffer? They did not dare to imagine. The stinky waves hit the boat, and there were pieces of rotting meat of different sizes in the waves. The deck was full of stinky seawater and the pieces of rotting meat that smashed over. In the distance, a huge figure broke the surface of the sea, and part of it was exposed. It turned in a circle, and then plunged back into the sea. They could not see its specific appearance, but the people of the fleet could clearly remember its huge size. Only a part of it was exposed, and it was already so huge. Then, how big was the whole sea beast? The most shocking thing was that there was more than one such sea beast. Farther away from the fleet, there were many other huge figures. What is that? Why are there so many sea beasts? I've never seen them on the sea before. Those sea beasts are a little strange, like... The longboat tribe member stammered as he looked at the sea. He was so shocked that he could not speak. Death aura, Gonchie said as he looked at the sea. You mean? Muefe looked at Gonchie in shock, waiting for an explanation. They're all dead, Gonchie said concisely. You mean none of those huge sea beasts were alive? Some people did not understand. If they were dead, why could they still move? But on second thought, there were many puppets made from corpses in the desert. But what they did not understand was that there were only a few of them. But now, there were huge sea beasts on the sea. They could even control dead sea beasts. It was a sunny day, but everyone felt a chill run down their spine. It was as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over their heads. If all the sea beasts that appeared in the distance were to attack them, would they still be able to survive? This was the sea. They're leaving. Someone shouted excitedly. The others also looked over when they heard the voice. They discovered that the sea beasts that had stirred up the sea surface and had yet to reveal themselves were indeed moving away from them. But that's the direction Xiaoxian left. Muefe exclaimed. So this is the trouble Xiaoxian mentioned? Their target should be Xiaoxian, said the Mang tribesman. If Xiaoxian had not left and was still on the ship, would those sea beasts have attacked their fleet? If those sea beasts had really attacked the fleet, what were their chances of survival? Muefe did not dare to think about it. The result would have been disappointing. On the other hand, after Xiaoxian left the fleet, he noticed that there were rotting beast carcasses on the sea. Some even had bones sticking out of them. Yixiang could even enslave these sea beasts. The sea beasts that appeared all had the same target, Xiaoxian, who was flying in the air. Many of the sea beasts that appeared from all directions had been living in the deep sea and rarely appeared on the surface. Their lives were long over, but today, they were once again exposed to Yangguang. Xiaoxian did not know how many sea beasts of this size Yixiang could enslave. He was glad that he left the fleet early. Looking at the sea beasts that were only partially exposed, Xiaoxian patted Cha-Cha. Keep going. Cha-Cha was much faster than the sea beasts. Xiaoxian didn't know how fast the sea beasts were when they were alive, but now, the enslaved sea beasts were far slower than Cha-Cha. The beast horde was gradually left behind. Xiaoxian continued to fly according to his original plan. He could first find a safe place to hide from this attack. However, even if he avoided this attack, there would be a next time, and a time after that. Xiaoxian had a feeling that if he avoided Yixiang's attack this time, he would have to pay a greater price the next time. Since he could not avoid it, he had to face it head-on. Chapter 838. On the shore, the mountains were replaced by sand. Past the tall barrier, the greenery disappeared. The sandy soil was filled with the smell of death. Even near the sea, the air was drier than anywhere else. This was the climate here. Past this area, they would enter a true desert. Xiaoxian had planned to enter land. Whether it was the mountains or the desert, it was better than not being able to rest on the sea. But just as he sent Cha-Cha in that direction, Xiaoxian sensed more danger. It was not safe on land. In the distance, densely packed dots rose into the air. They gathered together like a huge dark cloud, bearing down on Xiaoxian. A flock of birds. It was coming from the flock of birds, and there was an obvious smell of death. Puppets. They came prepared. Xiaoxian did not expect Yixiang to be able to control so many birds. The dried corpses in the desert aside, even the giant sea monsters in the deep sea had been turned into puppets. Now, even the flock of birds were puppets. Xiaoxian did not know how many birds Yixiang could control, or what was waiting for him ahead. But at least for now, he knew that flying towards land was not a wise choice. Yixiang had set up a huge net to trap Xiaoxian on land, trapping him at sea. Head for land? There must be more danger waiting there. The flock of birds was not the only thing hiding there. Xiao Xian's instincts told him so. Xiao Xian had an advantage on land. But in his current situation, heading for land was not a wise choice. Further ahead was the desert. The desert was even more advantageous to Yi Xiang. Retreat? Back to the mountains? That was not a good idea either. Was he really going to be forced to the sea? Looking at the figures still following him, Xiao Xian slapped Cha-Cha. Keep going. Xiao Xian didn't know what he would encounter if he continued to move forward, but he could feel that he had the best chance of survival. The yellow of the desert and the blue of the ocean were distinct. From time to time, one could see half-masked men in tattered clothes hurrying around. They were not from Rock Hill City, but from the scattered desert bandits that were active at the border of the desert. Further ahead, there were no longer any figures of those people. Instead, there were some stone houses built along the coastline. Near the house, there were people in golden armor moving about. Others stood motionless like wooden pillars. They were the famous puppet army of Rock Hill City. Xiao Xian had heard that the two sides had stopped fighting for a while, so he hadn't seen any intense fighting. It wasn't just the desert. Xiao Xian could also see the coastline of the other continent. In this direction, the further one flew from the sea, the closer the two continents were to each other. However, many people would rather travel by sea than pass this area because of the fighting. Even during the ceasefire, any suspicious person would be mercilessly attacked by both sides. The royal city's army obeyed orders to the death. They would rather kill an unknown person than let them go. The desert's army was even crueler than the royal cities. The closer the two continents were to each other, the more people from Rock Hill City and the army stationed along the coastline. At the closest point, both sides could clearly see each other's movements. When Xiao Xian passed by in the air, he naturally attracted the attention of both sides. A team of archers appeared on both sides, watching Xiao Xian cautiously. If it wasn't for the fact that the eagle was flying too high, they would have drawn their bows the moment they saw him. Should we send someone to take a look? In the army, a man with a bow asked the leader. They sometimes encountered such situations. When it was difficult to hit the target with a bow and arrow, they would send out some cavalry, soldiers riding birds. They also had teams that could fly. However, the leader only stared at the sea with a serious expression. He didn't answer, nor did he look at the figure flying in the air. The leader didn't say anything, and the people below didn't dare to act on their own. They all waited quietly for orders. The people who had been observing the leader noticed that his expression was changing. At first, it was just a cautious and serious look, but then it became a little doubtful. Soon, his eyes were full of surprise. His face quickly turned pale, as if he had seen something terrible. Retreat! The leader used all his strength to roar. The archers were so frightened that their hands trembled and they shot a few arrows. However, no one cared about that. The leaders retreated first. At that speed, it was as if they would lose their lives if they were one step slower. On the other side of the shore, on the other side of the desert, a dense crowd of people had already started moving before the leader of this side had given the order. Everyone was retreating in the direction away from the shore, leaving not a single person behind. They had completely retreated. Some people who didn't know what was going on wanted to ask what happened, but when they saw the sea in the distance, they were so scared that their hair stood on end. Look, what is that? Someone asked in a trembling voice. Sea beasts. Sea beasts. Why are there so many sea beasts coming? Don't look, run. Whoosh. Waves many times higher than the walls of the royal city rose and slapped at the people on the shore who didn't have time to evacuate. Huge figures broke through the waves and leaped out. Rotten flesh mixed with the fishy smell of the sea water and was slapped ashore. The barracks built on the shore were washed away by the water. Those that didn't collapse were crushed by the giant sea beasts when they jumped ashore. Many people thought that these deep-sea giant beasts would be stranded once they came ashore. However, when they saw the giant beasts moving their developed pectoral fins and caudal fins, they were all dumbfounded. There were also many fish that didn't look like ordinary fish. They were covered in scales and had thick hard skin and claws. They were more similar to lizards and crocodiles, but their bodies were flatter. These giant beasts moved faster on land than other sea beasts with fins and caudal fins. Everywhere they passed, the barracks were raised. What scared them even more was that none of these giant beasts were alive. They were just like the puppet army in the desert that should have been dead. Other than retreating, they didn't know what to do. In front of such giant beasts, he didn't even have the courage to draw his sword. A bird that was shot down by someone landed on the ground and flapped. A soldier waved his sword and cut off the bird's wings. The wingless bird continued flapping as if it couldn't feel the pain. Its gray eyes and the aura of death proved that it wasn't a living creature. However, it could still move. If its wings hadn't been cut off, it would have flown up long ago, even if it had been shot by an arrow. Desert. It's the people from the desert. Their voices were filled with fear. They had fought with the people from Rock Hill City many times and naturally knew that these half-dead creatures were created by the people from Rock Hill City. However, they had never seen such a formation before. Even if they had seen some puppet beasts, they were never at this level. Whether it was the size or the formation, they were far inferior to this. Could it be that the people from Rock Hill City were going to launch an all-out attack? Everyone shuddered at the thought of this. A chill ran down their spine. Were they really going to face such a terrifying scene? With their small bodies, wouldn't they be crushed to death if they went up? However, as the royal city's army waited nervously for orders from above, they realized that the giant beasts that came ashore didn't seem to care about them at all. Instead, they continued to move forward mechanically in a straight line. They crawled across the land area where the two continents were closer to each other until they entered the sea again. The flock of birds in the sky gradually disappeared. The giant beasts that came ashore also crawled across the land and entered the sea. When the last giant beast entered the sea and no other sea beasts appeared for a long time, the royal city soldiers who were guarding the coast finally let out a sigh of relief. There was still a rotting stench in the air. Large stones were rarely seen on the ground. They were all crushed stones. The barracks were all gone. Only the messy footprints on the ground proved what kind of frightening event they had just experienced. Compared to this, the puppets they had faced in the past were like child's play. "Boss, those sea beasts won't appear again, right?" A soldier asked in a trembling voice. "I don't know." The leader's hand that was holding the hilt of his sword was still trembling. He didn't know who was controlling those dead beasts, but it definitely had something to do with the people from Rock Hill City. At the same time, they were also puzzled. If the people from Rock Hill City had such power, why didn't they do it before? Who was the person who flew across the sky just now? No one would be able to resist such a lineup. Even the power of a city would not be able to resist it. That was probably beyond the range of what a human could withstand. On the other side of the river, at Rock Hill City, Xueqi looked at the herd of beasts in silence. He had rushed over as soon as he received the report. He knew that Yi Xiong was going to hunt down Xiao Xian. Yi Xiong had been injured in the battle with the Yi family. The one who had injured him was not the Yi family, but Yanjiao's Xiao Xian. Rock Hill City's greatest threat was not the royal city, but Yanjiao. In this day and age, the only one who could threaten Yi Xiong was Yanjiao's Xiao Xian. What happened just now meant that Yi Xiong had decided to go all out to hunt down Xiao Xian. There were many ways to get rid of a threat: direct, indirect, direct or indirect. If Xueqi wanted to get rid of someone who threatened his position, he would choose indirect or indirect methods. But Yi Xiong was different. Whether it was the Yi family or Xiao Xian, Yi Xiong's choice was always direct and direct. At most, he would play a few tricks, such as forcing Xiao Xian out of hiding. However, for the Yi family, direct confrontations like this in the real world were extremely taxing and draining. Yi Xiong had paid a heavy price to survive until now. He would not have spent so much effort unless it was something really important. Even the war between Rock Hill City and the Six Tribes was not something that Yi Xiong cared about as much as others thought. This was why Yi Xiong had never done anything like this before. However, Xueqi was confident that with Yi Xiong's abilities, if he set his mind to something, he would definitely succeed. The Yi family was an example. Once Yi Xiong killed Xiao Xian, Yanjiao would no longer be a threat. Even if Yanjiao allied with Royal City in the future, Rock Hill City would have nothing to fear. There were still tens of thousands of puppets waiting to be enslaved in the underground palace. Yi Xiong did not need to do it himself as Rock Hill City had already trained a group of shamans who could control the puppets. Xueqi thought to himself that once Xiao Xian was taken care of, he would send someone out of the desert. Rock Hill City's reputation should not be limited to the desert. Xiao Xian did not know what Royal City's coastal garrison and Rock Hill City's people were thinking. He was only following his instincts. He had no idea what was waiting for him ahead. He was like a hunted prey. He would only know how to escape if he kept moving forward. Ahead was an endless ocean. To everyone's surprise, Xiao Xian did not go ashore or seek help elsewhere. Instead, he kept moving forward. Chapter 839. They had already passed the point where the two continents were closest to each other. If they continued forward, the two continents' coasts would start to separate, and the sea would become even wider. It was a place Xueqi had never set foot in before. After flying day and night without rest, Cha-Cha was still able to continue even though she was tired. Many giant mountain eagles would have to fly for a long time without rest before heading to Eagle Mountain. This was not the first time Cha-Cha had experienced such a long flight. However, Xueqi could already feel that Cha-Cha's stamina was severely depleted. If there was still a boundless sea in front of them, how long could Cha-Cha last? Where was their chance of survival? The wind was getting colder and colder. On the azure sea surface, white dots gradually appeared. They were not sea creatures, but floating icebergs. As they continued forward, more and more white icebergs appeared on the surface of the sea. At first, they could only see small icebergs bobbing up and down with the waves. Later on, large icebergs as large as mountains appeared on the surface of the sea. From time to time, they could see some seabirds or sea creatures resting on the icebergs. Xueqi let Cha-Cha rest on one of the icebergs. After hurriedly eating some of the sea creatures they had hunted, they continued flying. The sea creatures behind them were still tirelessly chasing after them. They had already closed the distance while they were resting. The totemic flame in Xueqi's mind swayed in the direction they were flying. Still in front? More and more white appeared in their field of vision. The azure sea water seemed to be ending in white. Icebergs? No, it was a land of ice covered in snow. The water vapor in the wind carried a bone-chilling chill. However, this kind of weather made the tired Cha-Cha and Xueqi feel invigorated. The giant mountain eagles were not afraid of the cold. Every time they went to Eagle Mountain, they had to pass through the ice plains at the top of the mountain. In terms of cold, Eagle Mountain did not lose to this place. However, this place was just too big. There was no end in sight. The 1,000-meter-tall iceberg made people shudder in fear. The seawater was covered by a thick layer of ice, and the ice layer extended far into the sea. The wide ice shelf was like an extended continent, and even a huge group of beasts could walk on it without worry. There were all kinds of strange blue and white icebergs, thick cliff-like ice shelves, and a white world of ice and snow in front of them. It was like a forbidden land floating on the sea that no one had set foot in. No living creatures could be seen. No one knew when this frozen world had existed, and how old it was. Cha-Cha landed on the ice shelf. Xueqi dismounted and stepped onto the white ice. The ice shelf here was actually 100 meters higher than the sea surface. However, when one stepped on the ice shelf, perhaps because the view in front of them was too wide, there was no obstruction until they connected to the land. Continuing forward in the direction of the iceland, one would see a mountain range of ice and snow. There were many mountains there, and most of them were made of ice and snow. This gave one the feeling of stepping onto a plane. Only when one stood at the edge of the ice shelf and looked down at the sea below would one realize that they were actually standing so high up. Xueqi let Cha-Cha rest at the side while he walked towards the land alone. People who came here for the first time wouldn't be able to tell the difference between land and ice, but everything was clear in Xueqi's vision. The ice shelf covered a wide area. Xueqi walked for a long time before he reached the edge of the land. However, to the naked eye, it was still white. A few hundred meters away from Xueqi's path, a huge iceberg had broken off from the ice shelf, forming a blue waterway. There were many ice floes of different sizes on the waterway. The seductive blue of the sea and the majestic white of the snow made this world of ice and snow look even more mysterious and cold. However, Xueqi was not in the mood to look at the strangely shaped icebergs. He was focused on the snow-covered land in front of him, and the mountain range that blocked his view. Step by step, he walked forward. Whoosh! The sound of the water rippling came from behind him. More sounds were coming closer. Xueqi did not need to look back to know that it was the puppet sea monsters under Yi Xiang's control. They were following him. The lifeless sea monsters swam over from the waterway, climbing up the ice shelf along the steep slope. Their sharp claws were nailed to the ice, creating a creaking sound. The sound of flapping wings and the sound of landing on the ice shelf overlapped, as if there was no pause in the hailstorm. Unknown seabirds were densely packed, like a dark cloud that covered the sky. The flock of birds dispersed, revealing a person in a sandy yellow cloak in the middle. The exposed hand that held the wooden skewer became even more shriveled, until it was only skin and bones. Behind the cloaked man, huge sea beasts climbed up from the edge of the ice shelf that was almost perpendicular to the sea surface like a cliff. Their huge beast claws stepped on the ice mountain. The sea beasts that should have lived in the warm sea were now completely unaware of the cold. When a few sea beasts were climbing up, the edge of the ice shelf cracked, and large pieces of ice fell into the sea along with the sea beasts. The cracked ice became icebergs floating on the sea surface, and the sea beasts that fell into the sea continued to climb up. No matter how many times they fell, they continued to climb up like tireless machines. More and more sea monsters appeared on the ice shelf. The flock of birds stared blankly at their surroundings with their grayish-white eyes. The once vast white ice shelf was now occupied by a group of beasts that exuded an aura of death. The group was still expanding. The E family was stronger than most tribesmen in terms of physical strength. That was why the E family would never engage in close combat. They either used spiritual attacks or other methods, such as Yi Xiang's favorite puppet enslavement technique. Many sea monsters in the deep sea had extremely tough bones. Even the Gongjia family's best weapons might not be able to cut through their bones cleanly. Plus, these sea monsters had the absolute advantage in terms of size. These were all excellent puppets. However, not everyone could enslave a puppet like this. Yi Xiang, who could enslave so many sea monsters, must have the power of his fire seed. Yanjiao tribesmen were physically stronger than other tribesmen, but compared to these sea monsters, they were nothing. With such a large group of puppets, even 10 Yanjiao tribesmen might not be able to defeat them. This was the first time Xiao Xian had experienced Yi Xiang's capabilities so clearly. Even when he fought the Yi family, Yi Xiang had never used his full strength. This time, Xiao Xian knew that Yi Xiang was really going all out. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and only a faint ray of sunlight shone through the gaps between the dark clouds. This bit of sunlight was unable to change the gloomy and depressing weather. The undulating icebergs on the surface of the sea and the irregular waves of the sea made the area look eerie and dangerous. As if oblivious to the sea monsters behind him, Xiao Xian continued walking towards the mountains. Xiao Xian. The sound of sand grinding in the desert rang out on the vast ice shelf and snowy ground. Although the sound was not loud, it could clearly be heard from afar. It was as if an ice-cold knife from the desert had slashed across the icy ground, raising a bone-chilling frost. Xiao Xian continued walking towards the towering mountains, not looking back. His footsteps were steady, not panicked by the army of puppets. "Where did you get the power of the ancestral shaman?" asked Yi Xiang. "You're asking me? Who should I ask?" Xiao Xian did not know how the special power came to him. It must have had something to do with the egg-like stone. However, he would not tell Yi Xiang that. "How powerful is the ancestral shaman?" asked Yi Xiang. This time, Xiao Xian did not answer. He continued walking, his eyes fixed on the towering mountains. He could feel the gaze on his back sharpening. Xiao Xian could feel that even with the power of the Yanjiao ancestors and the bone ornaments, he would not be able to wipe out this army of puppets that did not know pain or fear. It would be a waste of energy if he did that. He began to understand why Yi Xiang was pressing him so hard. One reason was that he saw him as the greatest threat. The other was that he was curious about the ancestral shaman's power. As for what would happen if Xiao Xian lost his life under such pressure, he could only blame it on his bad luck. That was indeed Yi Xiang's plan. Before Xiao Xian could answer, Yi Xiang stopped twirling the wooden bracelet. The large hood covered his face, hiding his expression. Only a sharp gaze could be seen as he raised his other arm. Chi! The group of puppet beasts that had been waiting suddenly began to move like machines that had suddenly received orders. Their hard claws slashed across the thick layer of ice that had been frozen for an unknown number of years, creating a cloud of icy mist. Even from 1,000 meters away, Xiao Xian could feel the murderous rage and murderous aura from the edge of the ice shelf, as well as the great power hidden beneath the bodies of the dead. However, Xiao Xian did not turn back. He frowned slightly as he looked up at the towering snow-white mountains before him. He suddenly smiled. The totemic flame in his mind no longer wavered. It only flickered, as if waiting for something. Looking at the towering mountains that had been frozen for an unknown number of years, Xiao Xian finally understood why the totemic flame had pointed him here when he was searching for a way out. Why his intuition had led him here. Even though he did not know what would happen and whether he could seize this opportunity with his current abilities, how would he know if he could win without trying? How powerful is the ancestral shaman? I don't fucking know. In that instant, Xiao Xian felt an indescribable madness rush into his mind. It was as if there were no emotions at all. He stopped thinking about the puppets and stopped thinking about where he was. Under the sudden burst of totemic power, totemic patterns covered his entire body. The bottom of each totemic pattern gradually turned red, as if red lava was flowing beneath it. Yanjiao's totemic power continued to flow as Xiao Xian was familiar with it. However, there was another force that was rising rapidly, attacking every blood vessel and bone. Chapter 840. The thumping of his heart seemed to be magnified infinitely, and his blood flowed like a flood that had been opened. Thick veins bulged and throbbed. In his mind, the soaring totemic flames were no longer so conspicuous. The white light that enveloped him was unprecedentedly bright, and white energy was constantly being released from it, crazily surging to every part of his body. Under the totemic patterns, the flowing crimson was gradually replaced by white. It was still Yanjiao's totemic patterns, but it was no longer the color that the Yanjiao people were familiar with. Whoosh! A ball of white flame appeared in Xiao Xian's hand. As he turned around, he swung his arm down forcefully, drawing an arc in the air before finally hitting the ground covered in a thick layer of ice. Bang! A muffled sound, like a thunderclap, reverberated in this world of ice and snow, and gradually spread into the distance. Because of this explosion, the world seemed to fall silent for a moment. The white flame burned on the ice, and its range instantly expanded. The shaman seals that he had seen many times before seemed to have been burned into the ice, extending in all directions, deep into the ground, passing through the towering mountains of ice and snow, and extending into the distance that could not be seen. In this short period of time, he had released all the power that his body could control, as well as all the power that he could not control. At the same time, his mental exhaustion attacked him at the same time. It was as if there was a ball of fire burning in his body, and all his exhaustion was replaced by intense pain. However, Xiao Xian did not care about that at this moment. He felt very strange. He was clearly standing on the ice, facing the approaching horde of beasts, with his back against the towering mountains, and in terms of size, he was as small as an ant. However, Xiao Xian felt as if he was standing at the top of the world. His state of mind, his aura. It was the feeling that the white flames gave him. Raising his head, Xiao Xian looked at the horde of beasts charging towards him. At this moment, everything seemed to slow down in Xiao Xian's eyes. The sound of the approaching beasts' claws stepping on the ice also gradually faded away. There was no worry, no fear. Under his calm face, Xiao Xian flashed a look of anticipation that even he did not notice. He could feel the power of the white flames seeping into the land of ice and snow. Beneath his feet, the mountain behind him, and even further away, it covered a wider and wider area. In this world of ice and snow, there seemed to be an enormous and cold murderous aura awakening and brewing. Xiao Xian looked in Yixiang's direction. Yixiang was completely covered by the huge beast puppets. The Yi family was not physically strong, but they knew how to protect themselves better. But it did not matter. He knew Yixiang could hear him. I've always wondered who the overlords of the world were before the rise of mankind. Do those former overlords still exist? Where are they? Xiao Xian's calm voice was not loud, but Yixiang heard it clearly. Yixiang was confused. The next moment, Yixiang's hand paused as he tightened his grip on the string. Ignoring Yixiang's reaction, Xiao Xian retracted his gaze and looked down at his feet. He lifted his front foot and stomped down. Ka. A crack appeared under Xiao Xian's feet. Like a fuse, the crack started under Xiao Xian's feet and spread outwards. The cracks grew bigger and more numerous, and the sound of ice cracking became louder and more frequent. Behind Xiao Xian on the tall ice mountain, the crack also spread upwards, and continued to extend to both sides of the mountain range. In front of them, as the group of puppet beasts approached, the cracks on the ice shelf appeared even faster. The tremors on the ice surface were transmitted to their feet, and the vast ice shelf that had been frozen for an unknown number of years seemed to be about to be crushed by the huge group of beasts. Boom! A huge gust of air broke through the ice, causing everyone's hearts to tremble. A huge ball of ice shot into the sky. Even from 1,000 meters away, with the beast puppets blocking his view, Yixiang could see the sudden explosion of ice that seemed to reach the clouds. He could feel the terrifying power hidden within. Not far in front of Xiao Xian, where the beast puppets were about to reach, which was also the true border of the snowy land, the ice cracked. The violent tremors caused Xiao Xian's body to sway, but Xiao Xian ignored the cracking ice. His eyes glowed as he stared fixedly at the area where the huge ball of ice had erupted. This was his powerful counterattack against Yixiang's relentless pursuit. He had used all his strength in this attack, gathering all the power in his body and refining it. The power of Yan Jiao's fire seed supported his body, allowing him to use the power of the strange white flames in his body. The power of the white flames had already seeped deep into this uninhabited snowy land. This was no longer a battle between swords and sabers, but a clash of fire seeds. The white flames that burned in the world of ice and snow blossomed with ancient glory and an unyielding will. Boom! Another loud sound of ice breaking rang out, as if it was going to tear the space apart. Frost spewed out from the bottom of the ice like countless stars shooting into the sky, blurring the herd of beasts in front of them. A gigantic beast claw covered in tough leather armor broke through the thick layer of ice. A greenish-gray body with blurry stripes was gradually revealed as the beast claw moved. Boom! 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 Similar scenes appeared one after another on the ice. Beasts as large as the sea beasts, never seen before in forests, oceans, deserts and other places, broke through the ice one after another. The ice beneath Xiaoxian's feet cracked and bulged. Plates of bone rose from the ground like sturdy walls, their arched backs pushing through the cracked ice, revealing the giant beast that had been sealed in ice for a long time. Behind Xiaoxian, the towering snowy mountain range rumbled and began to crack as well. Xiaoxian walked forward step by step, climbing up the beast's back until he stood on top of its head. This was their burial ground. Today, Xiaoxian had allowed them to reappear. Their bodies that had been buried for countless years had finally seen the light of day again. Even if they were no longer alive. Somewhere far away from the royal city, in a place that was regarded as the end of the continent, a team was braving the cold wind and walking on waist-deep snow. It wasn't snowing today. Even if it didn't clear up in the next few days, there shouldn't be a snowstorm. They could use this time to search for gems. Yes, although most places on this continent didn't have gems because of the core seed, in this snowy land where the core seed had never appeared, adventurers would occasionally find gems. Before the two continents were close, most of the gems used by the slave masters and nobles were mined from here. This team was a frequent visitor here. Compared to other teams that traveled far for gems, they had a geographical advantage. They belonged to a tribe that was very close to here. Although the land they lived on wasn't very fertile and the climate wasn't very good, it wasn't suitable for growing crops. There were very few crops that could be grown and the output wasn't high. Therefore, there were very few people in their tribe who farmed. More people raised animals, such as sheep with thick fur. Most of the animals that could live in this place where the weather was cold all year round had thick fur that could resist the cold. However, if they only relied on raising animals, their tribe wouldn't have a good life. However, the truth was the opposite. Their tribe was very rich because of those rare gems. Every year, they would go deep into the snowy land to search for gems. The people of this tribe were also the type with strong physiques and battle strength. Otherwise, even if they dug out gems, they might not be able to keep them. This time it was the same. After many days of snow, it finally stopped. They looked at the time and organized a team to head to this snowy land that many people on this continent didn't know about. They started their usual treasure hunt. Their treasure hunting skills were inherited from their ancestors. However, even the oldest ancestral records never really understood this world of ice and snow. They only knew that this world of ice and snow was very big, and they did not know where the end was. It was extremely cold. When the weather was bad, even the most powerful warriors in the tribe would not be able to come out safely if they did not enter the cave they dug to avoid the cold in time. This was a world where danger and opportunity coexisted. It was also a treasure land for their tribe to survive. Unfortunately, after the disaster, the two continents got closer. More and more gems flowed into this place. This made the value of the gems they found so hard to find appreciate. The people in the team had been cursing since they set off. I heard that the Yanjiao people signed a contract with the royal city and brought a lot of gems. Will the price of our gems fall again? Someone complained. Another person heard this and snorted. He spat into the snow beside him. Damn Yanjiao people. If I see them. What will you do if you see them? The person walking behind him joked. I heard that the Yanjiao people all look like ferocious beasts. So what if they look like ferocious beasts? What's wrong with you? The person behind him didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. But when he looked up, he found that the person walking in front of him was no longer as joking as before. His face was solemn, and his eyes were cautiously observing his surroundings. Every step he took on the snow was not casual, and there was a slight pause after each step. After all, strangers didn't understand them. However, as companions of the same tribe, they understood each other's meaning through each other's every movement and every look. The team instantly quieted down, and the leader didn't need to say much. He walked silently at the front of the team, but his speed was much slower, and his footsteps were lighter. Every hair on his exposed skin stood up like a needle, sensing the changes in his surroundings. Chapter 841. At the edge of this land of ice and snow, they could still see some active birds, some cold-resistant wild beasts, and some scattered greenery. But as they went deeper, it was rare to see any living creatures. Usually, when they came out to hunt for treasures, they didn't have to pay attention to ferocious beasts, but the many dangerous places covered in snow. The surroundings were deathly silent, and after they lightened their footsteps, it seemed even more desolate. However, there was no sound, and they couldn't sense the existence of any living creatures other than them. Yet, there was a hair-raising force rapidly approaching, and they couldn't tell the specific direction. They could only roughly sense that the force came from deeper in this land of ice and snow. Even the dullest warrior couldn't help but shiver. What is this? Suddenly, there was a tremor under their feet, and it became more intense within a breath's time. There weren't any tall mountains around, so there was no need to guard against avalanches, and their field of vision was quite wide. There was no other abnormality, other than the constantly increasing tremor. From the initial faint tremor to their bodies swaying unsteadily, only a few breaths' time had passed, and they didn't have enough time to react at all. Escape. Where could they escape to? Suddenly, they heard some cracking sounds coming from under their feet. The ground is cracking. Run. The leader didn't hesitate anymore, and shouted for everyone to evacuate far away from this land of ice and snow. They had never encountered such a thing here. Even during the disaster, this place didn't have such a situation. Their tribe was on an island, and there were a few islands nearby. Across the strait, they could see the land where the noble slave master cities were located. During the disaster, although the ground trembled violently, it wasn't to the extent of cracking, and the only threat they had to face was a tsunami. At that time, there was a team that went out to hunt for treasures, and in the end, most of them returned safely. That was why they knew that this place where the gemstones were buried didn't have any cracks during the disaster. They had always thought that this place was a land of treasures, and it was intact during the disaster, and even had gemstones. But now they panicked. The dull cracking sounds were accompanied by rumbling tremors, so fast that they didn't know what to do. Boom! There was a loud noise in the distance, and it had an indescribable majesty, as if thunder had fallen from the sky. The ground that had been frozen for an unknown number of years was forcibly torn open, and even the largest ferocious beast they had ever seen could be easily swallowed by this crack. Not only was the crack extending outwards, but it was also rapidly expanding. The ground cracked, and the snow that no one had stepped on, which was covered in snow and looked like silk from afar, also cracked. The layer of snow was shaken away, revealing the hard frozen ground below. A violent gust of wind swept up the snow on the ground, wreaking havoc from afar. Looking at the large pieces of cracked land, the people in the group only had fear in their hearts. What should he do in such a situation? They didn't know. He couldn't even run away. The road behind them was also covered in cracks. They didn't know where was safe. In this predicament, they could only rely on their instincts to hide behind rocks that were not much bigger than their houses. They watched as the wind swept the snowflakes, ice, and gravel away into the distance. The rumbling continued in their ears, and the violent tremors on the ground almost shattered their bones. They could no longer hear the other people's voices, and could only see their companions' mouths opening and closing in the wind and snow, as well as their pale faces due to extreme fear. The thick leather armor on their bodies and the heavy weapons in their hands couldn't bring them any comfort. Some of them even hugged their heads in despair and hid behind rocks, not caring if the rocks would be overturned with the cracks. The dark clouds in the sky seemed to be even heavier, and the ground was no longer as calm as before. The wind whistled, and more snow was swept up, as if the thick layer of snow on the ground was about to be lifted off. The strong wind and snow made it impossible for people to open their eyes. They couldn't see a figure 10 steps away, let alone the faces of their companions. The wind and clouds surged, and the tremors and cracks seemed to explode the sky. Every sound made the people in the group feel as if they were being hit by a heavy hammer. Boom! Another loud sound rang out, followed by a violent tremor on the ground. This time, the tremor happened not far from the group. Countless ice shards flew up and collided with the large rocks, producing a dense crackling sound. A crack appeared not far away, and it split open in all directions. Many more cracks passed by them, and the wind seemed to be mixed with a chilling and unfamiliar aura, causing goosebumps to rise on their bodies. Bang! Large chunks of solid frozen earth were lifted off, and they could see the shadows of the flying chunks of earth in the wind and snow. They flew over their heads, and they didn't know where they would land. Something was approaching, but they couldn't describe this strange tremor until there was a bang, and their feet were off the ground, and their legs were numb. When they landed on the ground again, they saw a huge foot stepping in front of them. The cracked and uneven ground was caved in by the foot. The wind was still blowing snow, and their vision was blurry. But because they were too close and the target was too big, they could see what was in front of them. This was especially true for the few people who were closest to it. The huge foot was almost right next to them, and they were only 2 steps away from it. It was the foot of a ferocious beast. It was covered in skin with a scale-like texture, and there were some irregular cracks on it. Some of the sharp and large toes were slightly bent downwards, hooking into the ground. If the toes were dug out, a person could easily lie in them. Looking up, they could see the rough shape of the powerful beast's leg, and the tail behind it that could swing boulders. Looking up, they couldn't see clearly because of the wind and snow. They could only see a blurry shadow, as if it was the shadow of a giant beast in the clouds. The leader's face was aghast, and he almost peed in his pants. The other members of the team kept their mouths shut, afraid that if they made a sound, the huge monster would notice them. Their teeth chattered uncontrollably. In front of such a huge monster, even the calmest treasure hunter among them couldn't calm down, and they couldn't think of resisting. In comparison, they were as weak as cubs. The ground cracked, and the mountains in the distance collapsed. Rocks rolled down, and the sound of falling earth could only serve as the background. Among them, some rhythmic footsteps gradually became the main melody. Bang, bang, bang. Before this, the people in the team didn't know what those sounds were. But now, after seeing the situation in front of them, they understood. Those were the sounds of these huge monsters crawling out from the ground, from the mountains. The huge foot in front of them finally lifted up. The few people closest to it were so weak that they didn't know how to avoid it. They just stared blankly at the huge beast's foot. The beast's foot passed above them, bringing with it stone fragments and ice shards that fell down, smashing onto their heads and bodies. It was as if they could not feel any pain. Their gazes did not move as they continued to chase after the beast's foot until it passed them and landed on the ground again. Step by step, they walked towards the depths of the frozen land. The rhythmic footsteps gradually faded away. After an unknown period of time, the other sounds in their ears also faded away. The rumbling sound was like 10,000 beasts running together, deafening. The ground under their feet kept shaking. It wasn't as violent as before, but it still made their bones hurt. They seemed to have heard the sound of water, but they didn't dare to look. After an unknown period of time, the wind slowly stopped, and the sound of water stopped. The shaking of the ground slowed down, and the snow that shrouded above and blocked their sight also disappeared. The sky was still covered with dark clouds, and the pressure was stifling. After a long time, when everything calmed down and even the sound of snow falling could no longer be heard, the team that recovered from their shock stretched out their trembling heads from behind the rocks and looked in the direction of the beast's departure. The rocks they used to block the wind and snow had already rolled several times in the previous cracks. The ground was no longer white. Rocks and soil were everywhere, and the ground was overturned. There were debris everywhere, as if it was a newly cultivated farmland. The terrain seemed to have lowered a lot, and the mountains in the distance had disappeared, leaving only a few scattered bumps. However, compared to the changes on the ground, everyone was shocked by the situation in the distance. Their facial expressions were stiff, and their eyes were dull. They knew that after experiencing the earth-shattering tremors, there would be a huge change, but they still couldn't believe what they saw. Some people in the team didn't seem to believe it. They climbed up the rocks and stood on top of them, staring straight into the distance with their eyes wide open. The place they were standing on was slightly higher. From here, they could see that the end of their vision should have been mountains and land, but now, the mountains had collapsed, and the land that was perennially covered in ice and snow had a border. On the other side of the border, there was a wave. Sea. It's seawater. How is it possible? Although they didn't know how big this world of ice and snow was, they had been to places further away when they were searching for treasures. They had been to places at the end of their vision. Even with their eyes closed, they could tell how many mountains there were and which route was safer. But now everything had changed. The sound of water that sounded like thousands of beasts galloping was not an illusion. What happened just now? Was it a dream? The violent tremors, the collapsed ground, the violent wind and snow, and the huge beast's paw. When they recalled those scenes, their consciousness was in a daze. Was it real? Was it fake? What happened to the world they were familiar with? There were more similar places. Ancient beasts that had been frozen for an unknown period of time, the overlords of this world before the rise of humans, appeared one after another. Even though their lives had ended a long time ago, even though they had lost their consciousness, their bodies were still frozen in this land of ice and snow. Some of them were even perfectly sealed. The puppet technique of the enslavement secret technique was learned by Xueqi from the puppets in the desert. However, Xueqi didn't expect the white flame to be so powerful. Chapter 842. Xueqi stood on the head of the giant beast that had broken out of the ice. Beside him, the howling wind carried with it white flames. Behind him, the towering snowy mountains collapsed. Giant beasts of different sizes and shapes that should not have existed in this era stood there. Their eyes were dim and lifeless. The sharpness of the past was gone. However, their huge, cold and murderous bodies were enough to show how fierce they used to be. The sound of flapping wings approached from afar, coming from the depths of this world of ice and snow. Cha-Cha shrunk its head and was as quiet as a wooden chicken. It looked curiously at the giant beasts that had grown wings and flew into the sky. It had a strange sense of reverence towards them. It did not recognize these giant beasts. It had never seen them before. It had also never heard of them from its own kind or humans. If it had to be compared, the only one that was similar to these giant beasts in the sky was the small bird-like creature that Xueqi had melted from the ice on the surface of the sea. Heavy footsteps approached from afar. All the sounds in the surroundings gathered together to form a strange force. At this moment, it was as if a battlefield that had passed through thousands of years had completely erupted. The puppet beasts that were charging towards them were no longer alive. However, they still retained their valiance as the top predators in the current marine food chain. On this battlefield that seemed to have spanned hundreds of millions of years, one side was the new overlord of the ocean, and the other side was the ancient masters of the distant past. At this moment, they finally collided. The hard earth with layers of ice that had been flipped over was crushed in the blink of an eye. Wherever the giant beasts were on the battlefield, there was not a single piece of land that was intact. Rumble! On the vast frozen continent, there were cracks everywhere. Countless pieces of ice and gravel flew up. Large and small cracks were about to split the continent. The earth was sinking. No matter where it was like the end of the world. The ground was trembling. Unknowingly, the wind that had risen up became stronger. If an ordinary person were to approach this battlefield, they would definitely vomit blood from the shock. Even if they did not die, they would be knocked unconscious. The powerful airflow created by the swaying of the beast's tails and claws could tear a person to shreds. The ice shards with sharp edges were like sharp blades as they were swept into the battlefield by the wind. The sharp ice crystals that could pose a threat to humans simply shattered when they collided with the giant beasts. Even if they could pierce into the beasts' bodies, they couldn't go any deeper. Although they were already dead, and although many of them did not have hard armor, the rigid and firm muscles of the giant beasts, as well as the bones that could not be broken by sharp swords, could easily block the attack of these ice crystals. Even if these giant beasts were still alive, they wouldn't care about the ice crystals that wouldn't hurt them, let alone the fact that they were just mindless puppets. A muscular carnivorous beast had its tiny forelimb bitten off, but it didn't stop at all. Without any fear or hesitation, it rushed forward and bit down on the beast that was similar in size to it. Its powerful jaws allowed its sharp and hard teeth to penetrate into flesh that even ice crystals couldn't penetrate. It bit down on the beast's neck, tearing apart the beast's neck. There was no blood spurting out, only the remains with a rotten smell. A slightly smaller beast was bitten, dragged, and flung out. Its body flew into the distance, smashing into the ground with a bang. If it was in a quiet environment, it would be like muffled thunder, but in this battlefield, it did not raise the slightest bit of sound. The thick layer of cracked ice let out explosive roars. These giant beasts from the sky, land, and sea, whether they were from hundreds of millions of years ago or today, were like fierce demons that crawled out of a killing field, as if they wanted to destroy the world. There was no blood in their dead bodies. Their flesh and bones were broken in the fight, and the ground was full of broken limbs and remains. From time to time, The earth would explode due to the fierce collisions of these giant beasts. As puppets, under the control of the puppets, they could only use 10 to 20% of their attacking power. Even so, they still caused a destructive impact to this frozen land. The vast ice shelf and the snow-covered land had turned into a bleak battlefield. The ground was still trembling, not only because of the power of the fire seed, but also because of the huge number of giant beasts fighting against the powerful combat power. The ice and stone were solid under the ice, but when the beasts stomped on them, they were crushed into pieces. The vast ice shelf had unknowingly been split and shrunk. Broken ice and icebergs fell off the shelf and drifted away with the waves. The icebergs that floated on the sea were blown upside down by the airflow from the frozen land. The ice belt that stretched for several kilometers on the edge of the land had already collapsed. White flames burst out of the totemic patterns on Xueqi's body, as if they were going to tear his flesh apart. It was also these white flames that blocked the raging cold air in the surroundings. Staring at the battlefield, Xueqi did not relax at all. Even though he had used the power of the ancestral shaman to enslave these frozen giant beasts, controlling such a large number of beasts took a lot of mental and physical energy. Fortunately, the situation was tilting in the direction that Xueqi wanted to see. Giant beasts continued to climb up from the sea to the land, and also from the depths of the frozen land. Some were enslaved by Xueqi, while others were under Xueqi's control. Although Xueqi had brought many puppet beasts from the sea and other places, they were still lacking compared to the beasts in the frozen land. At first, they were able to gain the upper hand, but as more and more giant beasts from all over the frozen land joined the battle, the situation began to change. In terms of physical strength, the current rulers of the sea might not lose to the ancient giant beasts, but there were just too many of them and their bodies were too big. Xueqi had unleashed all the power of the ancestral shaman in his body the moment he arrived. Now, on the frozen land, a giant shaman seal was burning, as if it was going to burn the entire land. The white flames did not seem to have any temperature and did not melt the frozen ice and stone, but they were constantly awakening the ancient giant beasts from their slumber. It was as if a source of life had been injected into this uninhabited land. Xueqi wanted to enslave some of the giant beasts that were suitable for puppets, but the white flames burning in this snowy land prevented his fire seed's power from being further enhanced. This was something that Xueqi could not control. His fire seed was retreating. Although it was not as cowardly as the other fire seeds in the face of the ancestral shaman's power, it was retreating. Before this, Xueqi had always thought that his fire seed was stronger than the Yi family's fire seed, that it had evolved from the Yi family's fire seed. This was also why Xueqi's fire seed had more white flames than the rest of the Yi family. Before this, Xueqi had always wondered how his fire seed's power would compare to the ancestral shaman's. However, the ancestral shaman's power had not appeared in the world for a long time, and the records of the ancestral shaman in the ancestral records were mostly empty. He had once used up his life to perform a divination, but only managed to get a vague result. It was this vague result that made Xueqi think of ways to extend his life. He had waited for 1,000 years. The ancestral records of the Yi family recorded that a long time ago, the fire seeds of the various tribes were not created by the Yi family's ancestors, but were ignited by the ancestral shaman. The Yi family's ancestor said that he was the closest person to the ancestral shaman, meaning that the first fire seed ignited by the ancestral shaman was the Yi family's, which was the fire seed of the former Yi tribe. Therefore, many times, other than the Yi family's own ancestors, the Yi family also treated the ancestral shaman as their other ancestor. Xueqi's pursuit of the ancestral shaman's power had never stopped, but unlike the Yi family's reverence for the ancestral shaman's power, his pursuit was more like provocation? Yes, provocation. When the old men of the Yi family noticed Xueqi's intentions, they scolded him harshly. To many people, Xueqi of Yanjiao was Xueqi's greatest threat. However, Xueqi's main goal was not to kill Xueqi. He just wanted to see how powerful the ancestral shaman was, and whether he could surpass it. After all, Xueqi believed that he was the most powerful person in the Yi family in the past 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. Attacking the Yi family was a way to prove his strength. However, reality proved that he was still his grandfather, and his ancestor was still his ancestor. Even if Xueqi was not the ancestral shaman, and had only received a portion of the ancestral shaman's power. However, this small amount of power was still more powerful than Xueqi's. It was the same in the conscious world, and this time it was the same. Xueqi was using a similar method. Xueqi closed his eyes. This was a situation he did not expect, and he could not predict anything. This was the first time Yi Xiong realized the difference in power between him and the ancestral shaman. "It's not enough, it's still not enough," Yi Xiong said in a low voice. His voice was filled with complicated emotions, as if he was unwilling to give up, but also resigned to his fate. No one could understand what he was saying. Perhaps it was the exhaustion from controlling the beast horde, the pressure from the reversal of the situation, or perhaps it was his emotional turmoil, but Yi Xiong's body trembled slightly. His fingers that held the wooden bracelet slowly moved the carved wooden ornaments. Then, he suddenly tightened his grip and pressed his thumb on a circular wooden ornament. His sunken eyes, shrouded by the shadow of his hood, opened abruptly. Red light flashed in his eyes, as if blood was about to drip from them. At this moment, Yi Xiong's enslaved puppets stopped moving as if their power had been cut off. Some of them fell to the ground, while those that had just climbed onto land slid down the ice into the sea. Xiao Xian looked ahead. Without the giant puppets blocking him, he was standing on the head of a giant beast, and could see Yi Xiong. Had he given up? Admitted defeat? Chapter 843. Just as Xiao Xian was about to give chase and eliminate this threat, a huge crack appeared in front of Yi Xiong. The last part of the ice shelf that was still intact broke away from the mainland. Pieces of ice broke away from the ice shelf that Yi Xiong was standing on as the seawater drifted away. The ice shrunk and thinned as it rapidly disintegrated. In an instant, the ice shelf that could withstand the weight of a giant sea beast could no longer bear the weight of a frail person. The ice shelf had shrunk to the point that there was only one piece under Yi Xiong's feet. The buoyancy of the ice could no longer support him. That world is not just a world of consciousness. It connects the past and the future. Have you seen it before? As he spoke, Yi Xiong began to sink. By the time he finished speaking, he had completely sunk into the sea. Xiao Xian could no longer sense Yi Xiong's presence when he sank into the sea. There was no trace of the fire seed's power. It was as if Yi Xiong had completely disappeared. Unless Xiao Xian dived into the sea to look for him, he would not be able to find Yi Xiong, dead or alive. There were sea beast puppets, but they were inanimate creatures with no consciousness. They had no sense of sight or smell. They could not be used to find people. Xiao Xian scanned the area again but still could not find Yi Xiong. There was no way to pursue him. His ability to escape was impressive, Xiao Xian thought. However, Xiao Xian felt that he was severely drained. He was mentally exhausted and his head throbbed with pain, as if a giant beast was stomping on it. Continuing to pursue Yi Xiong would only worsen his condition. Xiao Xian was not as proficient as Yi Xiong in controlling a large number of puppets. If he was not careful, he would suffer a backlash. Xiao Xian did not want to suffer a backlash here. Xiao Xian stopped wasting energy controlling the giant sea beasts and decided to take a break. However, he soon realized that something was happening to the giant sea beasts he was no longer controlling. White flames burned from the bones of the controlled beasts. The tough ice crystals, the tough beast hides and meat, the bones that couldn't be pierced by blades and axes, everything was burned to ashes in the blink of an eye. The mountain-like beast was burned to ashes in the white flames right in front of Xiao Xian's eyes. The horde of beasts that had come from all over the place had all been burnt to ashes. Only the corpses of the beasts that Yi Xiong had enslaved were left on the ground, untouched. For the time being, Xiao Xian couldn't figure out what was going on. The only thing he was sure of was that the corpses of the beasts he had enslaved had all spontaneously combusted into white ashes in the white flames. After the battle between the beasts, there was no longer any layer of snow on the ground. There were only a few pieces of ice scattered everywhere. Large chunks of the ground revealed their original color, but now, after the beasts were burned, the ground was once again covered in a layer of white. The giant beast that Xiao Xian was originally standing on also turned into white ash. Even its hardest teeth and claws couldn't escape this calamity. As far as the eye could see, it was all white. Seeing something, Xiao Xian walked over step by step. The layer of white ash creaked as he stepped on it. It sounded similar to snow, just not as cold. Xiao Xian walked to a spot and looked at a protrusion on the ground. He raised his hand and brushed away the layer of white ash that covered it. It was a piece of ice, probably broken off when the iceberg collapsed. Fortunately, it wasn't stepped on by the beasts, and because of the cold temperature, it didn't melt and was preserved. What attracted Xiao Xian's attention was the thing in the ice. A clump of grass. A clump of grass that had been frozen for who knew how long. The grass clump was the size of a watermelon, golden in color and tangled together. Xian could even see the small fibers sticking out of the grass through the ice. He could even find some cuts on the grass clump. The cuts weren't even. They weren't cut by a sharp blade, but more like they were bitten off. Xian placed his hand on the ice. The ice slowly melted, revealing the clump of grass inside. If it was a normal grass clump, it would have been destroyed long ago. However, this grass clump was still frozen. When Xian held the grass clump, he felt a strange sensation on his fingers. He couldn't break it even if he used a little strength. Xian had never seen grass like this before. Perhaps it still existed in some unknown place, or perhaps it had already gone extinct. This clump of grass was made up of several stalks of grass. They were tightly bunched together. Xian spent some effort to untie them. Then, he braided these stalks of grass into a rope. When Xian saw this rope, what Yixiang said before he disappeared echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a spiritual world. It connected the past and the future? Where was the past? What was the future? Although he didn't understand Yixiang's intentions, Xian couldn't help thinking about it. He had a feeling that if he could see the past and the future, he would be able to discover something. He lowered his head and saw that he had finished braiding the grass rope. He smiled silently and sat on the ground to tie knots. Everything around him seemed to fade away. His surroundings were no longer white. Instead, it was replaced by darkness. After the complete darkness, Xian saw many sparkling dots of light, like stars in the night sky. This was a spiritual world. Xian didn't know what those light spots were. He just looked at the star-like light spots circling around him like a river of stars. Those flickering moving light spots seemed to contain a vast intent domain, which was mysterious and transcendent. The darkness was replaced by light. The dots of light became blurry, and the chaos around him gradually became clear. This was no longer a world of fire and darkness. Xian saw a world of color. There was golden grass around him, similar to the grass Xian found in the ice. The only difference was that there was too much of it, and it had already been bunched up. Looking around, there were eggs about the same height as Xian lying quietly on the grass. Not far away, there was a grass wall surrounding them. This was a nest? In the next moment, Xian confirmed his guess. Ignoring the eggs around him, in front of him, huge bird-like beasts were pecking and chasing each other. They didn't look like they were fighting, but more like they were playing. They were different from normal birds. They looked similar to the forest raccoons in the tribe. The only difference was that they didn't have wings or feathers. As he pondered, Xian realized that his vision was changing. It was as if he was flying, leaving the ground. This allowed Xian's vision to widen. This was a forest full of towering ancient trees. Suddenly, those strange featherless beasts all fled in panic. The ground trembled, and the branches shook. An even larger and fierce-looking beast stepped into this area. Its large mouth was dripping with blood, and it was biting tightly onto a beast that was less than a third of its size that was still struggling. Xian recognized what it was. Not to mention the ferocious beasts that lived in prehistoric times, Xian had seen one just now. He was the one who pulled those prehistoric overlords out of the ice. Although it wasn't the same as the one in front of him, they were of the same species. His vision went even higher. In the distance, there were other types of beasts that should have disappeared. Some had huge bone plates on their backs, some had bone armor on their heads, some had tails like meteors, some had necks like snakes, and so on. One by one, they appeared in front of Xian. Xian also saw some figures hiding in the bushes and hiding in the forest. Although he couldn't see them clearly, Xian was sure that they were humans. However, in this era, humans were only prey at the bottom of the food chain. Seeing them flee in panic in the face of a small beast, he knew that they lived a difficult life. If it were the Yanjiao people, they would have hunted down and killed the beasts. Xian somewhat understood. This should be the past, a very long time ago, before the fire seed appeared. Even if he couldn't really touch it, Xian could still feel the warm and humid climate in front of him. Entwined vines climbed through the forest. Thick tree trunks were covered with wet moss. Some unknown insects that Xian had never seen before flew around. There were also some huge mosquitoes, similar to the giant dragonflies that Xian used to ride in an airplane. After passing through the dense forest and over the tall mountains, he saw a flock of huge birds. No, those weren't birds. When they flew, they spread their huge wings. They were different from ordinary birds. They were the same as the one Xueqi saw in the ice. However, these beasts didn't have long tails. They were short-tailed. The largest ones were almost the same size as the largest eagle Xueqi had seen in Eagle Mountain. High up in the sky, a figure with a crest flew past and called out. On the land, some of the same species that were crawling to hunt or eat gave up on the prey they were chasing. Some of them held the prey they had killed in their mouths. They spread their huge wings and flew into the sky, following the figure at the front into the distance. More and more figures flew up. Some flew from the mountains, some from the forest, and some from the sea. In the end, they all gathered in the sky, blocking out the sun. Behind them, some flying beasts that were smaller in size and different in shape also flew up. This wasn't a flight of one species, but a flight of many species. They were like a long dragon with no head or tail. The bigger ones were at the front, and the smaller ones were at the back. Some of the faster ones were chased away and killed by the group in front. At the end of this group, Xueqi saw familiar figures. Those figures hanging at the end of the group were exactly the same as the pterosaur he had revived in the ice. This flying group of many species left the land and flew towards the boundless sea. After flying for an unknown distance, the land disappeared, and the blue sea was everywhere. The group at the front lowered their flying altitude and maintained a moderate distance from the sea. Those flying beasts with crests spread their wings and glided. They moved their stiff long necks and let out strange cries. At first, only the few leading beasts were crying. Soon, the flying beasts in front of them all started crying. Not long after, this long group of beasts also started crying. Their sounds were different, and it was impossible to tell if they were mixed together. However, if one looked carefully, they would realize that they all had the same rhythm. Chapter 844. There seemed to be something swimming under the surface of the water. The group started to descend and dive. The flying beasts closest to the surface opened their strong jaws and swallowed the fish that were swimming near the surface. Soon, there was no need to dive into the water. A large school of fish appeared on the surface of the water. Many fish jumped out of the water, their scales reflecting a dazzling silver light. To this group, this was a feast. The originally thin and long team was now spread out. Every one of them was excitedly hunting for food. The larger ones were even wolfing down their food, as if they wouldn't be able to eat their fill if they were a step slower. They ate many fish in one mouthful. On the other hand, the ones at the back of the group could only eat one fish. However, they were also very fast. The fish were eaten as soon as they jumped out of the water. In the end, only the bones of the fish fell into the water. Not long after, the group near the surface of the water started to rise again. The fish on the surface jumped even more vigorously, and their numbers increased. However, the group had already flown high and was far away from the surface of the water. Splash! A huge spindle-shaped figure jumped out of the water. Its spinning body splashed water everywhere. The splashing water reflected the dazzling sunlight. The rows of large and hard bone scales on its body were especially eye-catching. Xueqi felt that it was very familiar. Similar figures jumped out of the water and dove back into the water. The small fish that jumped out of the water earlier were probably driven up by this school of fish. In the air, they formed a long line and continued to fly. In the water, the school of fish with bone scales followed the same path. Looking at the small figures at the back of the group and then at the school of fish swimming in the water, it felt like déjà vu. Xueqi suddenly remembered a scene he saw in the tribe. The little pterosaur was standing on a tree and calling out rhythmically. Not long after, in the man-made river channel, the fish that the D mountain people sent to live in the sea and only returned to the river at certain times of the year to breed appeared on the surface of the water. Thinking about the situation back then, he looked at the scene in front of him. The migrating flying beasts and the migrating fish in the sea. It turned out that they already knew each other. Xueqi was like a bystander. He followed the migrating beasts and looked at this awe-inspiring and magnificent world. Everything seemed to be operating according to the fixed rules of survival. Thousands of years passed like a day. Until one day, a white light streaked across the clear sky and smashed into the ground. The exploding white flames scattered in all directions. The trees, fish, insects, birds, and beasts that came into contact with the flames were all set ablaze. The once arrogant overlords, with their huge bodies, sharp claws, and sharp teeth, could no longer help them. They could only howl in despair and roll on the ground in pain. White flames invaded this world. Xueqi watched as the beasts of all sizes ran towards what they thought was the safest place, where the flames couldn't reach. Many of them were stopped by the white flames midway and burned on the way. Humans, who lived in a narrow space, could not avoid it either. The people hiding in the cave were still unable to completely escape from the white flames. Those white flames seemed to be chasing after all life forms, wanting to burn everything. There were also flames that fell into the sea and kept burning as they fell into the depths of the sea. However, compared to the ground, there were much fewer flames falling from the sea. Therefore, many beasts living in the rivers, lakes, and seas avoided this calamity. The flying beasts that dominated the sky were not spared either. The humongous flying beasts with crowns on their backs were led by the largest flying beasts and flew in one direction in a group. Some of the beasts in the group could not withstand the flames and fell, turning into ashes. Some continued to fly with difficulty with their burning bodies. Xueqi watched as they flew to a piece of land, flew into the forest, and landed in a place. Their mountain-like bodies were stacked on top of each other, piling up into a tall mountain, like a collective cemetery. It was still déjà vu. The world was invaded by white flames. Those white flames could be seen everywhere. The former prosperity and vitality were no longer there. The beasts that thought they had reached a safe place escaped the burning of the flames, but they could not escape another calamity. The place where there were no white flames was instantly frozen. All the retreating creatures did not have time to escape, nor could they howl. After an unknown period of time, the world changed. The white flames were gone, as if they had dissipated into the air. Some of the trees seemed to have mutated and changed into different forms. The beasts that appeared also underwent huge changes. Those that crawled out of the water, crawled out of the ground, walked out of the forest, and so on. They were no longer the same as before. In the forest, on the other side of the towering mountain range, a figure broke through the ice and rose into the sky. Without its membranous wings, thick feathers covered its entire body. Its body had also undergone a huge change. The only thing that remained unchanged was its ability to fly. It spread its wings and let out a loud cry that broke the silence of the mountain range. The majestic figure seemed to want to fight with the sky again. However, only a few of them flew out after experiencing the flames. Most of them were buried in the mountain that had been piled up. Xueqi matched the scene in front of him with the place in his memory. This was the birthplace of the giant mountain eagles, and the place of their faith. Death and life seemed to happen in the blink of an eye. After suffering this calamity, when they crawled up again, they had a different appearance and were reborn. Xueqi's gaze crossed the distance and stopped at a seemingly ordinary mountain. In front of him was a cave. There were traces of human modification at the entrance. That was the place where humans lived. As night fell, the stones used to cover and protect the entrance of the cave were not moved by anyone. The entrance was not blocked. In the darkness of the forest, danger lurked everywhere, revealing its ferocity. The nocturnal beasts that had been reborn once again focused their attention on the weak individuals. Following the scent, they came to the entrance of the cave and surrounded it, quickly shrinking the encirclement. The stronger individuals pushed aside the other competitors and approached first, wanting to go in and kill their prey. However, the beasts that approached the entrance of the cave seemed to have smelled something bad. They paced back and forth, not entering the cave for a long time. A hazy white light appeared in the cave. As it gradually approached the entrance of the cave, it became clearer and brighter. When the white light approached the entrance of the cave, the nocturnal beasts outside seemed to have seen something terrifying. They retreated, their eyes filled with deep fear. A rough hand covered in scars trembled as it pushed aside the hanging vines that blocked half of the entrance of the cave. A figure walked out. He was only casually wrapped in a tattered piece of animal skin. He stood at the entrance of the cave and looked at the beasts outside. Finally, as if he had used up all his courage, he stepped out of the cave. In his other hand, a ball of white flame burned. It was this ball of white flame that made the nocturnal beasts, who were originally filled with bloodlust and murderous intent, shriek in fear as if they had seen their natural enemy. They turned their heads and rushed into the forest. Xueqi stood outside the cave and watched the figure walk out step by step. In the beginning, he was trembling as he tried to take small steps forward, but later on, he took bigger and bigger steps. The frightened look of the beasts made his steps firmer. When those beasts howled and fled into the forest, his shrunken back slowly straightened. Holding the fire seed, step by step, he left the pitch-black cave and walked towards a wider area, as if on a pilgrimage. The danger in the night moved away fearfully. The green eyes hidden in the trees sized up the person walking over. The fire had brought them change and new life, but they still could not avoid the fear engraved in their hearts. Seeing the person getting closer and closer, they let out unwilling roars and finally retreated and fled. The person focused on the fire in his hand, his eyes filled with desire and excitement. His unkempt hair was blown by the wind. His eyes reflected the white light of the fire, and strong emotions were fluctuating. A shout rang out in the forest under the night. Xueqi could feel the rising excitement and pride. White shaman patterns appeared under his bare feet that were covered in wounds and calluses. White flames rose from the ground and burned the approaching mosquitoes. Fire seed. A true primitive fire seed. This was the first person to control the power of the flame that changed the world. From this day onwards, humans were no longer squeezed into narrow cracks, no longer stepped on at the bottom of the food chain, no longer cowering in dark and narrow caves, unable to move forward. The morning sun broke through the curtain of night, bringing light back to the earth. The person standing there looked away from the fire in his hand and strode towards the direction of the rising sun. He walked faster and faster, and finally let go of all his worries and ran to his heart's content. In Xueqi's vision, the world was shrinking. The forest and the people had become blurry. The only thing he could see was the moving white flame on the continental plate, the first fire seed. The white flame was moving, and as it moved, balls of fire appeared beside it. The first was a ball of white and orange flames. After that, other balls of fire of different colors appeared beside it. Some were big and some were small. Some were moving in other directions, while others stayed where they were. Xueqi had seen some of them before. They matched the tribes. Xueqi found a ball of fire that belonged to Yanjiao. The two-horned totem appeared above the ball of fire. Not only Yanjiao, but also other tribes. The 6 major tribes of the royal city, Yanjiao, Hui, Mang, Yu, Han. There were also some that Xueqi had never seen before. They were very unfamiliar. As the most primitive fire seed, the white fire seed ignited many balls of fire. Therefore, it would not be rejected by the fire seeds of other tribes. The balls of fire that were ignited were the foundation and core of each tribe's establishment. The fire seed of the tribe, the source of the totem's power. The appearance of fire was destruction and innovation. It was respected and feared. Everything was reborn from the heavenly fire. That was a world-class nirvana brought about by the fire seed. After the destruction, there would be life that would emerge from nirvana. It would be colorful and beautiful, and it would grow upward. Humans were perhaps the biggest winners of that disaster. Chapter 845. As time passed, some of the fireballs were extinguished while others moved further away. Xueqi's gaze focused on one spot and the scene was magnified. A pair of old hands brushed the rain-soaked ground and scooped up a clump of dirt. White flames emerged from the palms and the clump of dirt rolled, becoming smaller and more solid. Finally, it took the shape of an egg and became a rock. Xueqi could not see the person's face clearly, but he recognized the rock. However, after the stone was formed, the white flame gradually disappeared, and the figure also became blurry. In the end, it returned to the clouds. The stone flashed with white light, but it was not with the other fire seeds. Instead, it was hidden behind a cloud of mist, as if it was the most mysterious star hiding behind it. This was the past that Yixiang had mentioned. Xueqi wanted to see the future, but his body was so tired that he couldn't maintain this state. There was still time. As he left the world, Xueqi felt his consciousness slowly returning. His nerves relayed the sensations around him. The cold reminded Xueqi that he was still on the frozen continent. He opened his eyes. He still held the golden rope in his hand. His surroundings were still white, but unlike before, it was now covered in a thick layer of snow instead of white ash. Other than the area around Xueqi, the snow was knee-deep. An eagle screeched from a glacier not far away. Cha-Cha landed in front of Xueqi with a fish in its mouth. "Have you been waiting for a long time?" Xueqi looked at the eagle in front of him, remembering the scene he saw in the spiritual world of Eagle Mountain. He patted its head and walked towards the edge of the glacier. Xueqi knew that every time he entered the spiritual world, it felt like a long time had passed in the real world, even though it felt like a short time. When they first arrived here, Cha-Cha didn't have any major injuries because of the beasts chasing them, but there were still a lot of small injuries. But now, those injuries were completely gone. The new injuries should have been caused by the recent hunting. The remains of Yi Xiang's puppets had long been covered in snow and frozen by the new ice shelf. The collapsed ice shelf had once again covered the edge of the continent. It was not as tall as before, but Xiao Xian believed that with time, the ice shelf would return to its original state. The ice shelf was not a few hundred meters above the sea, but the thick layer of ice was enough for Cha-Cha to walk on, not to mention Xiao Xian, who was lighter. Time to go back. The surroundings were still quiet. The ice seemed to reject all life. However, when he left the spiritual world, Xiao Xian saw some brief images. He knew that if that was the future, the glacier would soon become lively. Looking back at the white ice, Xiao Xian leaped onto the eagle's back. Let's go. The sky was not as gloomy as it was when they first arrived. Yangguang's light shone through the thin layer of clouds. The ice mountain did not look so cold under the warm light. After Xiao Xian left, the frozen world remained the same. Day and night alternated. One day, on the quiet snowy ground, a figure emerged from under the snow. His back was black and his belly was white. His webbed feet stepped on the snow, and his body stood upright, swaying as he walked, looking blankly at the world of ice and snow in front of him. Behind it, a few similar figures came out from under the snow. They formed a group and wobbled towards the seaside. They jumped into the water clumsily. Some were knocked down by their companions and slid directly into the sea from the snow. In the water, their fin-like forelimbs were like paddles. They swam agilely and hunted excitedly. But not long after, the figures that jumped into the water scrambled to climb ashore. Some of them were too hasty. Not only did they fail to climb up, they even slid down a few times. It was very embarrassing. Not far from the shore, a slightly round head emerged. It was black with a tinge of white. It rose vertically from the water and slowly rotated. Its eyes curiously looked around, especially at the figures that climbed ashore. It stared at them for a while before slowly sinking back into the sea. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of ice plates cracking could be heard as a large crack appeared on one of the ice shelves. The crack was getting bigger and bigger, and the floating ice on the water surface was shaking violently. Looking from above, one could see that there was a huge black shadow approaching the water surface. Whoosh whoosh. Strong air currents pushed up high water columns on the surface of the sea. In invisible corners, there were many lives that were awakening. This desolate land of ice, which was once almost devoid of life, finally welcomed a lively day. On the other side, Cha-Cha flew back along the same path. However, it did not head towards the desert. Instead, it turned midway. It was already very far from the iceland. What entered its eyes were high mountains covered in snow. It gave people a cold feeling. The wind was like a cold knife. "You've been here before?" Xiao Xian asked. According to the rough map in his mind, they could indeed fly towards the tribe. However, they had to pass through the forest where the fearsome beasts lived. In the past, they had to enter the forest from the tribe. But now, they had to cross the unfamiliar mountain range. On the tall and uneven mountain peaks, there were several huge figures flying. They were giant mountain eagles like Cha-Cha. Except for Cha-Cha, most of the giant mountain eagles liked the high mountains covered in snow. Flying forward, Xiao Xian also saw the ice fields and glaciers on the high mountains. The environment was somewhat similar to the Eagle Mountain. He just did not know if this mountain range was connected to the Eagle Mountain. This mountain range was too long and too big. He could not see where the ends of the two sides were. The melted snow merged with the spring water from the mountain and flowed through the unfathomable canyon. Then, it flowed with the water from other directions into a large river. This river. Was it the river in front of the tribe? Was this the source of the river? What was the endless river all those years ago? That was not right. When Xiao Xian crossed the river that year, he had a feeling that the seemingly endless river was not as wide as it looked. It was just that his strength was limited back then and he could not see the mysteries behind it. There were still many secrets in this world. He just needed to discover them. Just like a long time ago, when the fire seed first appeared, if there was no one who could control it, fire would still be in existence that was feared by all life. Flying along the river, Xiao Xian saw many things he had never seen before. In the past, he had only set out from the tribe and entered the forest to hunt. The furthest he went was Eagle Mountain. But this time, he was going back from the other side of the continent. What he saw was different from before. Back then, you went around the desert from the Hui tribe and flew to Eagle Mountain from here? Xian asked. When Xian went to the other continent, Cha stayed with the tribe. During that time, Cha had left the tribe to fly to the Hui tribe and find his companions to go to Eagle Mountain. Oh, Cha answered, meaning that Xian was right. Even if it was a route they had never flown before, the mountain eagles had a natural instinct for the place they believed in. It was as if there was a compass in their heads telling them where to go. Therefore, no matter where they lived in the world, once they reached a certain age, they would be able to find Eagle Mountain. It was a natural instinct and a belief that was deeply rooted in their bones, even if they had never seen what their ancestors looked like. On the way back to the tribe, Xian would often look at the various fearsome beasts in the forest while hunting. It reminded him of the distant past he saw in his consciousness. The heavenly fire had changed the world greatly. The rise of humans was also due to their own opportunities. Otherwise, even if they could survive the fire, even if they could avoid the heavenly fire, they would still be at the bottom of the food chain. The world was cruel. Without power, one would only be hunted. After flying for a while, Xian finally saw the familiar hunting ground. His mood lightened up. The first time he walked into the forest with the stone knife, Xian realized that he had really come to this world and could not go back. After so many years in Yanjiao, he had gone from not caring about it to treating Yanjiao as his responsibility. Only Xian knew how it felt. After all, in the eyes of the Yanjiao people, Xian was still the person who walked out of the Crouching Bull Cave. Yanjiao's territory finally came into view. Below them, the patrol team was running and shouting excitedly. In front, the shaman and chief were already waiting with their men. Inside the Flaming River trading point, Beimi was bringing some people to look at their new house. When they arrived, Beimi decided to buy a big house in Yanjiao's trading point and sent some people to stay here for a long time to buy gems and other rare items from the other continent. As they were talking, they suddenly heard cheers from the Yanjiao tribe on the other side of the river. It was so loud that even the noisy trading point could hear it. The horn sounded and the Yanjiao people in the trading point hurriedly ran over. What's wrong? What happened? The new travelers were confused. They hurriedly asked the others. Some of the elders who were familiar with the Flaming Horn tribe calmed down after the initial surprise. They pointed at the Flaming Horn tribe on the other side of the river and said, "It should be the Grand Elder of the Flaming Horn tribe. We don't know where he went, but he's back now." Then they gave the other party a look that said, "This is common, don't make a fuss." Beside the man-made river that was dug around the trading point, the little pterosaur threw a fish into the water and looked up at the withered leaf birds chirping cha-cha on the other side of the river. It spread its wings and flew up. As it flew over the river, it called out a few times towards the water as usual. A few spindle-shaped figures that were longer than humans leapt out of the water. Their large bony bodies spun in the air, drew an arc in the air, and dove back into the water. End. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.